loading boxes from a truck. Who would have imagined that a person could have a replacement who does all the work for him? The guy was lifting weights in the gym. The balance of the card appeared on the phone screen. This replacement could do anything. The young man was sitting in a sun lounger on the beach. His dream came true. The boy took off his sunglasses and thought about how he had such a life. A giant dragon attacked the city. The main character fell to the ground and opened his mouth in fear. His house was almost completely destroyed. Dead monsters lay around. Putting his weapon on his shoulder, the hunter asked his friend to collect all the corpses and thought about how hard he worked to get the most comfortable life. The monster hit the ground with his paw with force. The demon opened his mouth wide and screamed. The guy decided that it might seem stupid, that he was doing everything possible just to eat and play for his own pleasure. The young man smiled nervously and assessed the size of the enemy. The monster's eyes lit up. The hunter frowned sternly and ordered everyone to attack, realizing that he would never be alone. His squad charged at the monster. Two fighters jumped into the air above the enemy's head. The protagonist swung his sword. Red lightning flashed around him. The rest of his team held the demon down. Surrounded by his comrades, the boy delivered a crushing blow and thought about his special skill being cloning. A monitor was on in the dark room. A notebook was lying on the desk. There were bowls of food in the kitchen. The young man thought about how there were so many things in this life that he needed to do, but there were just as many things that he wanted to do. He was playing a computer game. The protagonist imagined himself sitting on a cliff and realized that he wanted to travel. The boy imagined clinking glasses with his friends and wanted to spend more time with them. The young man mentally took the hand of a girl and realized that he wanted to go on dates. A smile appeared on his face. He wondered why a person could only do one thing at a time and remembered that he always wanted to have two bodies. His clone appeared in front of him. His dream came true. People were walking along the busy streets. The bully smirked and said that he would definitely get a cool skill when he awakens. His comrade chuckled and said that he could use a skill that raises intelligence. Walking along the street, the boy found his life tiring. The protagonist looked away and wanted to get home as soon as possible. A crowd of people walked in front of him. He really wanted to have two bodies. The man brought the microphone to his mouth and asked for a moment of attention. The A-class hunter looked up and announced that he would be in charge of the 10th Portal Awakening program. Lightning enveloped the man's body. It turned out that this was a program launched by the government to help awaken abilities, during which people must cross a portal. Waving his hand, Bonte hoped that the city's residents would successfully complete their awakening and suggested starting right now. The first group stepped forward and stood in line. Sanu raised his eyebrows and realized that his turn would soon come. Holding documents in her hands, the girl greeted him and clarified his number and group. The guy confirmed that he was number 7 in the 37th group. The woman brought a scanner to his hand to check his identity. She pointed to the portal with her hand and asked the candidate to enter it, having previously left all his equipment here. The young man took a step forward. Bright lightning struck from the black rift. The student's eyes widened in surprise. The protagonist closed his eyes and stuck his hand into the portal. User identification began, and soon the system reported the completion of registration. Sanu opened his eyes wide. Putting his hand to his head, he felt severe pain and realized that he had momentarily lost consciousness. The people found themselves in a building with drones flying under the ceiling. The guy frowned in disappointment and noticed that he wasn't the only one who felt sick. The girl summoned a fire phoenix and was happy that she got such an amazing ability. People from different guilds immediately ran up to her to recruit her. Someone approached the young man. Smiling, the stranger congratulated him on waking up and asked how he was feeling. The student stood up and said that he was feeling sick. The man said that it would soon pass and asked if he had checked his skill. The protagonist frowned and said that he was just about to do that. A status window appeared in front of him. Sanu's eyes widened in surprise and said that he had gotten the cloning skill as soon as he thought about it. The guy looked at the values of his characteristics and was upset that they were so low. The young man raised his eyebrows and decided to check the skill description. The system reported that the maximum number of clones depends on the user's level and is currently equal to 1. The student thoughtfully scratched his chin. The awakened man's mouth dropped open in shock when he read that there were no special conditions for using this skill, and realized that it could be used for everyday activities as well. The stranger folded his hands behind his back and decided that his friend had already finished checking his status window. The protagonist confirmed this and said that everything was not so good. Smiling, the man asked him not to be upset, since all newbies have rather weak initial indicators, and asked what his skill was. Deciding not to hide it, Sanmu raised his eyebrows and replied that he had received cloning. The guild representative stared at him in amazement and grinned. The boy looked at him in confusion. He tilted his head and asked if it was really that bad. The stranger told him that there was a person with the illusion cloning skill, but since his clones did not have a physical shell, they could not do anything. The young man smiled and thought that his clones were not illusions. The man raised his hands and explained that this was much better than awakening without a skill, and said that he could show his skill to the officials standing nearby so that they could evaluate it more accurately. The student looked around. A crowd of people had gathered behind him. The boy raised his hand and it immediately turned to stone. The representatives of the different guilds were watching him carefully. The awakened man frowned sadly. The protagonist asked where the exit was. The stranger smiled and explained that before leaving this place, he needed to undergo a final scan and register with the research team. People entered the capsule one by one. White smoke appeared around Sanu. The man sitting at the laptop confirmed his skill and said that the probability of manifesting one or more skills was 73%. The employee raised his eyebrows and said that he had registered the cloning skill and that the registration form had been sent to the ID bracelet. The handrails on the bus swung from side to side. The guy looked at his bracelet and thought that everything ended faster than expected. A wave appeared on the small screen. The young man wondered what his new skill was. Clouds were floating above the city. The student entered the apartment and asked if his comrades had done a good job. There were several monitors on his computer desk. A battle was taking place on the screen. The awakened one sat down in a chair. He put his hands on the keyboard and decided to check something. An inventory and a description of the shield appeared on the screen, which the player did not like very much. The main character lay down on the bed and said that he did not care. Staring at the ceiling, Sanu thought about the fact that the popularity of games was falling anyway, and decided to hope for the release of some new game. Putting his hands under his head, the guy remembered that he needed to pay for tuition and rent, and wanted someone else to get a job instead of him. The young man jumped out of bed and remembered his skill. He looked at the ID bracelet and decided to check its effect. The student stood in the center of the room. Waves of light energy appeared around him. An aura enveloped his body. The awakened one opened his eyes wide and used his skill. A blue haze flew out from his chest. The gamer opened his mouth in fear and screamed. A thick cloud of energy appeared in front of him. A bright light appeared inside him. The flash lit up the room. Someone lowered their hand. Smoke flew around his feet. An exact copy of the protagonist appeared in the room. Sanu raised his eyebrows in surprise. A white haze enveloped the double's naked body. He stood firmly on his feet. The guy raised his hand. The young man's eyes widened in surprise and asked if it was really a clone. His exact twin raised his eyebrows and confirmed it. The student approached him and asked if he could touch him. The copy allowed him to do so. The awakened one frowned tensely and thought that he was too embarrassed. He slapped himself in the face to come to his senses. The gamer grabbed the double by the shoulder. The protagonist opened his mouth in shock and realized that this was a real physical body, not an illusion. A white haze covered the groin of the completely naked clone. Sanu smiled and said that he needed to put something on first. There was a wrinkled sweater on the floor. The twin put it on. The guy remembered that he could give him orders. The young man thought about asking him to sit down, and the copy immediately did so. The student smiled and realized that he didn't even need to say the orders out loud. The double stood up when the awakened one mentally asked him to do so. Then the clone sat down a few more times. His face was covered in beads of sweat due to fatigue. The gamer put his hand to his chin and decided that he had the same stamina as him. The phone vibrated in his pants pocket. The protagonist took it out and saw messages from his comrade. A conversation appeared on the screen. Jayando said that he had 2 hunter skills and asked his friend to answer him as soon as possible. Sanu started texting while his twin tried to catch his breath. In the chat, his comrade assumed that he had received some stupid ability and began to laugh at him. The guy frowned in displeasure and called him a real chatterbox. Suddenly, a message appeared in front of his face saying that his stamina had increased by 1,000. George was standing on the roof of the building. He was the owner of the Flicker skill, an S-class ranker who became the first person to pass Odin's tower, which no one had been able to conquer before. The elevator doors in the main building of the Enlightenment group opened. A guild employee entered the office and reported that at the moment, according to the analysis, 80% of the population of 300 million people were awakened. The guild leader asked how long it would take for 100% to awaken. The girl looked at the tablet and explained that, given the number of participants in the awakening program, they could expect it within the next 5 years. Looking at the city, the jumper decided that it was not that long. George was standing by the panoramic window. A giant skyscraper rushed into the sky. The protagonist went for a run. His face turned red and was covered in beads of sweat. The athletes sitting on the bench noticed him. One of them assumed that he would soon faint because he was running in such clothes. Sanu sat down on the bench. Someone handed him a bottle of water. The stranger smiled and offered him a drink before the next lap. The guy opened his mouth but remained silent. At that moment, the young man got up from the bench and ran on. The woman looked after him and assumed that he was just an introvert. The student ran through the park. At home, he woke up and stood on the scale and saw that he weighed 78 kilograms. The slimmed-down gamer pursed his lips. His body became a little more athletic. Scratching the back of his head, the protagonist realized that he had lost 9 kilograms this month, despite the constant feeling of hunger, and thought that he was doing nothing, and his body was getting better day by day. Sanu looked at the notifications about the increase in characteristics and decided that it was not for nothing that they say that skills come from a person's hidden desires. The guy sat down in a chair and remembered that he had learned something while using clones. The young man imagined how he hit his copy and how it ran around the park, and concluded that its pain and fatigue were not transmitted to him. After an exhausting run, the double melted into thin air. Clones disappear if they receive damage or spend energy above the limit. The student looked at his twin. Its appearance directly depended on the appearance of the owner. While the awakened one lay on the bed, his copy continued to exercise, despite the large distance between them. The gamer clenched his fist and ordered the double to use his skill, but this was impossible. The protagonist closed his eyes and thought that this was quite logical, since otherwise he would have an infinite number of clones. Some time ago, Sanu was sitting at the computer in complete darkness. The Hunter's wiki appeared on the monitor. The boy raised his eyebrows and realized that he never thought this day would come. A search bar appeared on the main page. It turned out that there were normal and special stats, but most awakened ones only had normal ones, and that the method to unlock special stats was still unknown, with a few exceptions. A status window appeared in front of the boy. His stats increased slightly. The student smiled and thought that he was able to raise his stats so quickly because the clone was training non-stop and doing everything possible to fulfill this order until he reached the limit. The awakened one put his hand behind his head and wondered if this meant that he could double the points he got if he moved with it. The gamer picked up a flyer for a gym. The flyer said that this gym provided a personal trainer and a full range of exercises. The protagonist looked up from the flyer. A battle was taking place on the computer screen. Sanu smiled and decided that he would be the head and his double would be the limbs. The guy unlocked his phone and looked at his balance. The young man frowned and realized that he didn't have enough money to pay for the registration. The student looked ahead and remembered that he had spent a lot of money on food. He looked away and decided that he needed to find a part-time job. The awakened one placed his hands on the keyboard. The gamer raised his eyebrows and thought that he needed to find some construction work because it would help him train his body and earn money at the same time. The protagonist looked at the list of vacancies and realized that he should do it himself first because the clone would not be able to succeed if he was given an order in an area unknown to both of them. Sanu frowned with interest. A description of a vacancy appeared on the monitor for the Vukan Logistics Center, which was looking for a delivery worker. The guy pressed the call button, considering this vacancy ideal. The young man put the phone to his ear and said that he saw an advert for workers on the website. The manager explained that there would be no preliminary interview and that he could come straight away and start working. Sitting in front of the computer, the student said that he wanted to start working tomorrow. He raised his eyebrows in surprise when the employee of the center asked if he could start working today. The awakened one looked away and answered that it was possible. The employee of the company said that he would be waiting for him at the logistics center at 6:30. The gamer pressed the end call button and wondered if there was no one else working there. The protagonist leaned on his hand and decided that he did not care as long as he was paid. The trucks left the center. Sanu put his hands in his pockets and assumed that this was the very place. His clone's face was hidden under a mask and a cap. The guy looked at him and decided that if he said that this was his twin, something could go wrong. The young man raised his hand and asked his double to answer questions well and call himself Jundo while working. Scratching his head, the student thought that this building was too big and wondered where he should go. The awakened raised his eyebrows in surprise when someone called out to him. The man smiled widely and asked what brought him here. The gamer opened his mouth wide and recognized him. Doc Chill shook his hand and said that he didn't even recognize him because he had lost weight. The protagonist thanked him and explained that he came here with a friend for a part-time job. The employee pointed at the building and said that he should go there since the office was there. Sang Woo scratched the back of his head and thanked him. The man said goodbye to him. The guy put his hands to his cheeks and thought that his nerves couldn't stand this. The young man looked through his fingers. The student asked if his copy was nervous. Number 1 looked at him and said no. The awakened one looked at his bracelet with confidence and remembered that he now had strength. The gamer went ahead and suggested that they finish their business quickly and go home to eat ramen. The exhausted protagonist lay down on the boxes and realized that he was too confident in himself because the delivery work was too difficult. The clone took a large box. The loader was dragging the box to the car. The company employee was sorting out the cargo in the warehouse. Sangwoo raised his head with difficulty and wondered if these people really had any skill in dragging heavy things. Doc Chill extended his hands to help the double remove the box. The sweaty guy realized that he should not have come here because his copy was doing just fine on its own. There were trucks parked near the center. An hour-long break was announced. The guys were sitting by the wall of the building. The young man looked very tired. Someone handed him a can of soda. The man smiled and explained that he needed to replenish the fluid in his body. The student thanked him. A local worker sat down opposite him and asked the name of this diligent loader, who had not said a word during this time. Number 1 introduced himself with a false name. The center employee smiled widely and concluded that his friend was doing this kind of work for the first time. Looking up, the awakened one confirmed this and called the work quite tiring. Sitting opposite him, Doc Chill chuckled and said that he and his friend had courage, since most of the guys would have already run away by now. The gamer tensely pursed his lips and thought that he would have been among them too if not for the money. The man looked at him and asked where he studied. The protagonist answered that he studied at Jeongguk University. The clone drank the soda in one gulp. The local worker called Jeongguk a great school. Sangwoo replied that he could not say the same. Looking away, the center employee asked him not to be modest and explained that he would give anything for his daughter to go there. Smiling, the guy asked him not to worry about it and told him that he also did not do very well in school, but still managed to get in. Doc Chill raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked how he managed to do it. The young man replied that he was able to get a couple of licenses and a special permit. The man happily raised his hand and said that this was a great option. Suddenly, he thoughtfully raised his fist to his chin. The local worker smiled and asked if his friend wanted to get another part-time job. The student opened his mouth in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The center employee extended his hand and offered to tutor his daughter instead of getting tired here. The awakened one widened his eyes in shock. The gamer thoughtfully looked away. A phone screen appeared in the memory, on which the meager balance of the card was shown. The protagonist frowned in confusion. Sangwoo extended his hand forward and asked if he would need to pull up her in all subjects. Doc Chill confirmed this and explained that he was embarrassed to say such a thing about his own daughter, but she was actually a bad student. The man spread his fingers and offered 50,000 won for each 2-hour lesson a couple of times a week. The boy looked away and decided that it wasn't that bad, considering the time it took. The boy shook his friend's hand and agreed, and the local worker thanked him for his help. Standing up, he promised to contact him after discussing it with his daughter and asked if he still had his old phone number, which the student confirmed. The awakened one looked up at the sky and hoped that everything would work out with the tutoring. A notification about the increase in stats appeared in front of him. The gamer smiled widely and was happy that he got both the job and stats. The loader left the warehouse. The protagonist turned around and remembered that he still had something to do. Sonu opened the black bag and decided to have a snack. However, the bag was empty. Number 1 was already eating his second sandwich in a row. The boy smiled nervously and closed his eyes. The clone threw an entire bag of buns into his mouth. Sitting opposite him, the young man asked if he had really eaten everything. The next morning, the student was lying on his bed. The awakened one gritted his teeth and said that he was about to die. The gamer got out of bed and decided to use the double for this part-time job from now on. A message about increasing characteristics appeared next to him. The protagonist realized that the twin was still working. Closing his eyes, Sonu asked him to come back and thought about how he wanted to recall him and call him again, because if he did not do this at home, his clothes would disappear. There was a pot of soup on the table. The guy smiled broadly and was glad that he was able to eat a hearty meal. Suddenly, the young man looked down. The door of the apartment opened. Number 1 came inside and announced his return. The student looked at him in surprise and asked him to wash himself and change his clothes. Water dripped from the shower. There was dirty laundry in the basket. The awakened one approached the clone who had just come out of the shower. The gamer frowned and asked him to give him a hand. The double raised his hand. The tense protagonist took a sharp needle in his hand. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. Sonu remembered that if the copy was recalled, his body would scatter in the wind, because it was not a person and not a living creature at all. The guy pierced number 1's finger with a needle. A drop of blood appeared on it. The clone looked ahead indifferently. The young man took a handkerchief and asked him for forgiveness. The rag absorbed the blood. The student wondered when the regeneration characteristic would become available to him. A description of regeneration appeared on the hunter's wiki page, which could be mastered by constantly leaving wounds on your body. The awakened one leaned on his hand and asked himself if this characteristic would appear if he did this for another month. The gamer pursed his lips and thought that he was afraid to inflict a wound bigger than this, so he should stop there. The protagonist looked at the doppelganger and asked him to eat ramen whenever he felt hungry and to continue training. Sangwoo handed him his spare phone and told him to take it when he went to work and to make sure to answer his calls. The sun's rays illuminated the houses. The guy was walking down the street holding an advertising flyer. Suddenly, someone put a hand on his shoulder. The young man turned his head and saw his friend. The student removed his hand and said that it was too hot today. Jayondo was surprised that his friend had lost so much weight. The awakened one narrowed his eyes and explained that he was working out and was on his way to the gym. Putting his hands on his stomach, the brunette said that these were also muscles and asked which gym he was going to. The gamer replied that the gym was called Strong Body. The man gave him a thumbs up and said that it was a good place. The protagonist raised an eyebrow and remarked that he didn't see anything special about it except the price. The guy smiled broadly and said that the trainer there was a real beauty. The young man grabbed his friend by the shoulders and offered to go there together. Sanu realized that his friend didn't go there to exercise at all. Bright lamps illuminated the corridor. A pumped-up man was lifting dumbbells. Treadmills stood along the wall. An athlete was lifting a barbell. Someone was eating meat with chopsticks. The guys entered the gym. Scratching the back of his head, a local employee apologized and greeted the guests. The heroes said that they would like to register. The gym employee smiled and told them that they had discounts on the occasion of the opening, so if they took a subscription for 3 months, it would cost them only 160,000 won. The guy raised his index finger and decided to take the membership and asked if the trainer could check if he was doing each machine correctly. The man put his hands on the table and agreed to help him and offered to help with the payment. There were many different machines in the gym. The young man lifted the barbell with difficulty. The student stood up from the machine, and the local worker explained that this was how to do an incline bench press and suggested that he gradually increase the weight and speed up. The athlete lifted the barbell and screamed loudly. There were 4 50-kilogram plates on each side. The guys looked at the athlete in shock. The gym goer holding the dumbbell opened his mouth in surprise. The man working out on the treadmill widened his eyes in amazement. The strongman secured the barbell to the stand. Jayendo tensed his arm to show off his pumped-up muscles. The trainer approached him and assumed that he had been working out for a long time, and the brunette replied that this was his first time. The gym employee put his hand on his chin and suggested that he had a power boost after awakening and asked what his current level was. The guy replied that he had 2 units of power. The awakened guy raised his eyebrows in surprise and realized that the skill his friend had never talked about was power. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. The gamer wondered how strong other high-class hunters were if a simple power boost skill had such a serious effect. Sitting on the bench, the protagonist realized that it was not for nothing that everyone only talked about hunters. The phone in his pocket vibrated. Sanwoo picked up the phone and heard Doc Chill's voice. Holding the phone to his ear, the guy heard that his colleague had already talked about tutoring with his wife and daughter and wanted to know if he had time right now. The young man stood up and confirmed this. The man offered to meet him at their house to talk. The bright sun illuminated the city. Standing in the elevator, the student was upset that Jayendo had not registered even after this performance. The brunette pointed at himself and said that his friend would not be able to work out properly if he signed up for the gym. The awakened one asked him to admit that this did not happen only because there was no cute trainer there today. The athlete looked down and confirmed this. The gamer put his hands in his pockets and decided that it would be even better this way because he would not have to worry about the clone. There was a sign with an apartment number on the door. The protagonist realized that this was the right address. Sanu put his ear to the door and heard disgruntled shouts. It turned out that no one knew that the tutor was coming. Dakshil abruptly opened the door and said that he was going to work, so his daughter could tell the tutor herself if she didn't like something. The man looked back and opened his mouth in amazement. The guy who was hit with the door put his hand to his cheek. A young girl came out into the hallway. The schoolgirl's eyes widened in surprise. The young man put a rag to his head. An employee of the logistics center approached him and apologized for not noticing him. The student replied that everything was fine. Someone put a plate of sliced apples on the table. The woman smiled broadly and said that she did not recognize the boy. The awakened one explained that he had been playing sports recently and that they had not seen each other for a long time. The gamer removed the rag from his head. Hayoung's knees trembled when the protagonist asked if she was his student. The girl blushed in embarrassment and confirmed it. Her parents smiled widely since their daughter was complaining about tutoring just a few seconds ago. Sangwoo introduced himself and asked if she really wanted to go to Jungkook University. Looking away, the girl confirmed it and thought to herself that she was embarrassed because he probably heard her screams. The guy smiled and said that he wanted to see her grades before classes started. The schoolgirl's mouth opened in fear. The boy nervously pursed his lips when he picked up the report card. The penultimate column said that the student had a rather low rating. Hayoung covered her face with her hands in shame. Dakshil carefully picked up his jacket. The man ran to the exit and shouted that he had to go to work. His wife called him a traitor. The student looked up. The girl looked sadly at the floor. The awakened one smiled and said that everything was fine and that he didn't have good SAT scores either. The girl clasped her hands and asked if that was true. Looking at her, the gamer offered to do everything possible to help her get in and decided to discuss the class schedule. White clouds floated above the buildings. The protagonist returned to the apartment and thought that they had a long way to go. Some time ago, Sanu poked his finger at the schoolgirl's notebook. The student began to write something diligently. The guy hung the sweater on a hanger and was glad that she was not as hopeless as expected. The young man went to the computer and decided that number 1 had probably already gone to work. The student raised an eyebrow and remembered that he had given him a spare phone, but if the number of clones increased in the future, he would need to buy another one. Sitting down in his chair, the awakened opened the Hunter Wiki to search for skills similar to his own. The screen showed many items being sold. The gamer flinched in shock when he saw that the familiar skill was selling for 100 million won. Tears welled up in his eyes because the teleportation skill scroll was selling for 400 million won. The protagonist leaned on his hand and decided that he would buy a house instead of a skill if he had that kind of money. Sanwo leaned back in his chair. Looking at the screen, the boy thought about how it would take him forever to buy even one skill and wondered if hunters really made so much money that they could afford all that. The young man picked up his phone and saw that its balance was only 200,000 won. The student lay down on his bed and sighed heavily. The awakened placed his hands under his head and asked himself if he should become a hunter. The gamer opened the news feed on his phone to find information about hunters. He got out of bed. The protagonist frowned tensely and thought that he could not waste such a great skill on slave work. Sonu grabbed his sweater. The guy put it on and decided to try to become a hunter. The system reported the unlocking of the vitality skill. Demons came forward. In the year 2000, portals began to appear all over the earth at the same time. An army of the undead pursued strong monsters. Because of this incident, later called the Great Catastrophe, more than half of the world's population died. The living dead leaned on his sword. At the same moment when the catastrophe began, super people with special abilities began to appear. The awakened stood in the shadows. With them on the front lines, humanity barely managed to win this war. The man took a crystal out of the monster's body. Now a profession for hunting the remaining monsters appeared. These specialists began to be called hunters. The young man was watching a video on his phone. The lecturer explained that if he passed the test, he could get a state license and legally kill monsters. The student took out his earphone at the moment when the teacher suggested analyzing several subtleties that would help when passing the test. The awakened man opened his mouth in surprise. In front of him was a tall building that housed the hunter's center. The gamer stretched his shoulder and thought that due to the unlocked vitality, lately even a couple of hours of sleep was enough for him to feel alert. The protagonist entered the building. The arms dealer showed the buyer a sword. The man was assembling firearms. The stranger's face was hidden by a hat with long brim. Sonu's eyes widened in amazement. People were walking around the building. The guy concluded that only a few were taking the test. The girl raised her hand and said that registration for the exam to obtain a hunter's license, which would take place in the basement, would end in 20 minutes. The young man lowered his head and realized that he was very nervous. There was a sign next to the door that said exam room. The student walked in and apologized. There were many people sitting in the lecture hall, and they all stared at the awakened one. The gamer trembled and wondered why there were so many of them. The bully smirked and laughed at him along with his comrade. A man in a military uniform entered the room. He put his hand on the table. Looking up, Myung-won greeted the people present and announced that he would be their examiner. Frowning, the man explained that the licensing exam consisted of a written part, a practical test, and an aptitude test, and that those caught cheating would be disqualified without the right to retake, and asked if everyone understood everything. The hunter looked at the lecture hall from under his brows and said that they do not forgive cheaters. The bully opened his mouth in amazement. The protagonist frowned tensely and felt a strong pressure. The soldier standing behind the lectern announced the start of the exam. A white car was driving along the road. The stranger said that they would transfer everything by the end of the month. Shouts were heard from the earphone in his ear. Sitting behind the wheel, the man asked his boss to wait and said that he had been working in this field for several days. He closed his eyes, listening to the shouts of his superiors. The CEO of JM smiled and thought that this could drive one crazy. The agent raised his eyebrows and said that money does not come easily, but flows away like sand through your fingers. The watch on his hand showed 7:45. The man concluded that the hunter exam should be over soon. The car was driving along a long bridge. A message appeared above the identification bracelet congratulating him on receiving the F-class hunter status. The protagonist looked at it in confusion. Sonu scratched the back of his head and thought that passing this exam was as easy as getting a driver's license. At first, the guys sat at the table. The questions at the written stage were very simple. You just needed to remember a couple of things. Then the guy went to the shooting range and picked up a gun. Before the practical test, they were given a lot of time to prepare, and the target was hanging quite close. Then they sat at the table with Myung-won. The aptitude test turned out to be a moral conversation from elementary school. Looking down, the young man thought about how this job involves risking life and using weapons, and wondered if it was normal that the entry threshold was so low. The student turned around. The rays of the setting sun illuminated the building. The awakened one decided that the government seemed to want everyone to become hunters. The protagonist closed his eyes and said that he should not worry about it. On the street, people in black suits approached people. They handed out business cards to everyone who had just passed the exam. One of them held coffee in his hands and chatted pleasantly with the hunter. Sanwoo raised his eyebrows and assumed that they were representatives of the guilds who were trying to recruit them. Someone also handed him a business card and congratulated him on passing the license exam. The boy took the card and saw the name of Agent JM. Junmo smiled and offered to cooperate, promising to give him the best deals when buying or finding items for hunting. The young man scratched his head and thanked him. Suddenly a message appeared in front of him. The student's eyes widened in surprise when he saw that his cloning skill level had been increased and that he had another clone available. When the man started telling something about the agency, the awakened one ran away and promised to contact him later. The CEO burst into tears and asked him not to forget about it. In the evenings, the lights were on in the windows of the house. The hunter covered his face with his hand and laughed. Number 1 stood in front of him. The protagonist decided that nothing could be better than cloning. Another double appeared from the smoke. The coppers looked at each other. Sanwoo said that he was looking forward to working together. The guy showed the twins a business card and said that they were now ready to become hunters. Junmo threw the business cards on the car seat and realized that he had given out almost all of them. The man straightened his tie and hoped that they would contact him. He looked out the window. The official representative office of Korea's leading guild, Heesun, towered over the city. Documents lay on the table. The employee took a sip from his mug and said that his colleague only needed to settle the amount according to what was written in the documents. The JM CEO took them in his hands and said that he understood everything. Suddenly, he raised an eyebrow in surprise. The documents in his hands contained the total prices for different monsters. The agent, carefully studying the documents, noticed that this amount was rather suspicious, because troll blood should cost much more. Sitting in a chair, his colleague called him over. The employee Heesun grinned and remembered that his comrade had long wanted to join the guild, which meant he should start thinking for himself. Junmo's eyes widened in surprise. The man put the mug on the table and asked what they would be left with if they followed all the rules. The employee put his hand on the colleague's shoulder and asked him not to interfere in the internal affairs of the guild. The JM CEO tensely clutched the documents in his hand. Sitting in the car, he thought that he would have kept quiet if he had known how hard it would be for him. The phone rang in the inside pocket of his jacket. The agent stuck his hand in to take it out. Junmo put the phone to his ear. The protagonist introduced himself and said that he would like to clarify a few things. There were many signs on the buildings. The man entered the cafe. Sangwoo, who was sitting at the table, called him over. The CEO of JM sat down across from him and apologized for being late. The guy replied that he had just arrived. The cashier was standing behind the counter. The heroes decided to order a drink. There was iced coffee on the table. Smiling, the agent asked if his client would like to go to a territory that even a newbie could handle, and upon hearing an affirmative answer, asked permission to know his skill. Holding a coffee in his hand, the young man replied that his skill was cloning. Junmo put his hand to his chin and remembered that this was a skill that creates illusions that are incapable of anything. The student drank all the coffee in one gulp. The man realized that this was a newbie with illusions that are physically incapable of anything and will not help in hunting. Handing him the documents, the JM CEO called his skill excellent and asked him to read the terms of the contract. With his arms outstretched, the agent recommended the slime hunting grounds because they were the least dangerous monsters, and explained that one must wear a mask and protective clothing to enter the grounds, and that one should not stay there for too long because of the toxic fumes. The awakened took a picture of the contract and said that it would not be a problem for him. Junmo raised his hand and added that there was also a horned hare hunting grounds that had a safe barrier for shooting, but the prey was hard to catch, making it very difficult to make money from. The hunter carefully studied the contract, and the man said that there were also low-class monsters such as giant rats, but only the aforementioned monsters lived in areas where his company could guarantee safety. The protagonist raised his eyebrows and said that he liked both places, and that the price of the items for sale also looked attractive. Sangwoo placed the documents on the table and said that he wanted to enter into the contract. The CEO smiled and thanked him. He picked up the notebook and asked which territory the client would choose. The guy stamped it and thought the agent had misunderstood something. The manager winced when he saw that someone else had stamped it. A red mark appeared on the document. Junmo looked away in surprise. The boy smiled and explained that he would be hunting in both places at once. A while ago, a man sitting in his office asked if his client had the cloning skill. The man in the ninja suit confirmed it. The CEO of JM raised his hand and asked him to show his ability. The awakened one raised 2 fingers and agreed. 2 illusions appeared next to him. Lightning flashed in the office and 4 copies of the skill owner appeared behind him. The agent smiled happily. The clone pulled out a sword from behind his back. The doubles pointed the weapon at their master. The manager raised his eyebrows and asked them to stop. The copy swung the sword. Several blades pierced the hunter at once. Junmo covered his face with his hand in horror. The client asked him to calm down. The man looked at him tensely. The awakened one passed his hand through the sword and explained that it was not real. The CEO of JM tried to touch the sword. but his hand passed through the blade. The clones turned into white smoke. Their master said that this was a good skill to distract monsters. The agent covered his face with his hand and sighed heavily, saying that he had seen enough. Now the manager opened his mouth in shock and thought that they had passed a cloning skill that he had come across. It was definitely related to illusions. In front of him sat a double of the main character. Junmo remembered how he held the contract in his hands. In his memory, the copy even drank a glass of coffee. The man gritted his teeth and realized that he had never encountered such a thing before. The CEO of JM looked up and assumed that they were twins. Sanwoo closed his eyes and laughed. The guy pointed at his clone and decided that this was a reasonable assumption. The young man placed his hand on the shoulder of the double. He had an indifferent expression. The student explained that his skill can actually be confused with another, but it is not an illusion. The awakened one raised his eyebrows and said that he has another copy, but it is currently in the fitness center. The agent opened his mouth in surprise and asked if clones can really build muscle. Showing him his biceps, the hunter confirmed this and added that his body also becomes stronger thanks to this. The manager realized that his client can raise his stats with the help of doubles. Putting his hand on his chin, Junmo called it amazing and decided that this man has great potential since his skill is completely incompatible with F-class. The protagonist placed his hands on his waist and suggested returning to the issue of the hunting ground. Sanwoo raised his hands and asked if there could be problems due to the same person entering two places at once. The man raised his eyebrows and said that there could be problems with this since there is a record at the entrance. The boy shed tears and decided that his plan would not work. Pointing behind him, the JM CEO promised to talk to the association to find a way to solve the problem and asked if the client could come with him to scan the bracelet and show them his skill. The boy scratched his head and warned that he would not be able to use the skill until tomorrow evening due to the cooldown. Looking at him and his clone, the agent suggested meeting at the Hunter Center in 2 days. The manager took a pen and remembered the contract. The student picked up the seal and reminded him that he had already left it on the documents. Junmo suddenly stood up from the table. The man extended his hand and said that he was looking forward to their cooperation. The awakened smiled. They shook hands. The hunter looked at the man and said that the feeling was mutual. 2 days later, clouds were floating above the skyscraper. The protagonist looked around. Sanwoo looked back when someone called out to him. The JM executive adjusted his tie and noticed that his client had arrived quite early. The guy explained that he thought they were expecting him and asked if it was true that the association was located in the hunting center. The agent raised his hand and replied that most of the departments operated in this building. A small device issued a ticket with a number. There were many people in the building. A voice invited numbers to different windows. The center employee raised his eyebrows and asked if the visitor really wanted dual access to the hunting areas. Sitting opposite him, the young man confirmed this and explained that he had the cloning skill, but the identification bracelet existed in only one copy. The employee said that he was the first since the jumper to request a duplicate. While the employees were looking for the necessary documents, the student tensely pursed his lips and decided that this was quite expected since this was not a typical situation. Sometime later, the worker, putting a pile of papers on the table, explained that it was an application for a permit and asked the visitor to go to the government office to fill out the necessary documents. The heroes opened their mouths in amazement when they saw how many papers there were. Taking them in his hand, the manager promised to sort them out and asked his client to go to the showroom. The awakened one thanked him. Junmo handed the documents to the center employee. The hunter approached the girl in a robe. Lightning flashed around him. A completely naked clone appeared in front of him. The protagonist opened his mouth in fear. The woman adjusted her glasses. The mechanic was working on the machine. The engineer carefully looked at the bracelet. The old man raised his thumb and said that now the doubles can enter the hunting area by scanning their fingerprints. He handed Sin the bracelet and explained that they took into account the possibility of simultaneous entry and exit from different places, as well as repeated entry. The man put his hands on his shoulder and said that his skill was not seen before not only in Korea but in the whole world. The guy hugged his double and said that it was time for them to go. The mechanic frowned in disappointment and thought that he would make a great research subject. The young man raised his hand and said that he had settled everything. The CEO of JM congratulated him on this. The student smiled and was glad that the preparations for the solo hunt were finally complete. Raising his eyebrows, the agent confirmed this and asked if his client was going there right now. The awakened one said that he had no other business today anyway. The manager crossed his arms and asked why his copy was hidden behind a mask. The hunter replied that he did not want to draw unnecessary attention to him. Someone was watching their conversation from the balcony. The stranger standing in the shadows chuckled. Heesung scratched the back of his head and was surprised to see this person here. Junmo looked back when someone called his name. There was a bang on the balcony. The guild leader jumped down. He smirked and stated that it had been a while since they had seen each other. The protagonist frowned sternly. The man furrowed his brows in disbelief and was surprised that his colleague was still dealing with hunters. Sangwoo looked up and realized that the man had just jumped from several stories. The CEO of JM tensely pursed his lips. The agent bit his lower lip and said hello. The scoundrel clutched his stomach and laughed at him. Heesung looked down at him and asked who that boy was. The manager frowned and replied that he was a hunter who was affiliated with their company. The guild leader raised his eyebrows. The man looked at the boy wearing a hoodie with a large inscription and said that everything was clear to him. He looked down appraisingly. The boy was wearing simple black pants and sneakers. The student looked away in displeasure when the villain suggested that he was only in F class. Heesung covered his face with his hand and decided that his colleague, who used to work with C and B classes, had completely gone crazy. The guild leader opened his mouth wide and laughed because he couldn't believe that his comrade was supervising an F-class person, and in such an awful hoodie. Junmo's eyes widened in anger. The awakened one placed a hand on his shoulder. A smile shone on his face. The man wiped away a tear. He loomed over the hunter like a menacing shadow and noticed that he apparently had something to say. The protagonist closed his eyes and grinned. Sanwoo rubbed his nose and said that he was very honored to meet the head of the guild, which is considered the first in the country. The villain put his hand to his chin and was glad that there was at least some common sense in his words. The boy covered his face with his hand and declared that his guild was the first in dungeon monopoly and hunting area bans. Heesung looked up. A malicious grin appeared on his face when the boy said that he couldn't believe that he received praise from the guild leader who had the highest payout ratio in his favor. The student smiled widely and declared that he didn't even know what to do now. The man scratched the back of his head and called him quite brave. His eyes sparkled. Suddenly, the villain appeared behind the awakened one and asked if his skills were the reason for his bravery. The hunter turned around in fear. The man in the black suit opened his mouth wide and called out to his boss. The assistant ran up to the boss. Heesung was upset that the fun breaker had come. The guild leader let the protagonist go and decided to call it a day. He smirked and asked his name. Sanwoo raised his eyebrows and suggested that he find out for himself. The man waved his hand, calling him funny and promising to see his colleague next time. The scoundrel headed towards his employee, who asked him not to act like that inside the building anymore. The heroes were sitting in the car. Junmo smiled awkwardly and thanked his friend for his actions. The guy leaned on his hand and explained that he couldn't just stand there and watch. From the driver's seat, the man asked if he knew about his relationship with the Heesung Guild. The young man raised his hand and said that he found out about it while researching the agency. Sitting at the computer, the student noticed that there wasn't much information about him online, but he did find one rumor that concerned his agent. An article from the Hunter Wiki appeared on the screen, where the user wrote that the JM representative was a former Heesung Guild employee and warned that those who signed a contract with him would face the road to hell. Holding the steering wheel, the manager realized why no one was joining them anymore. The awakened one explained that people were simply afraid of being targeted by a large guild. Junmo asked why the client chose their agency. In that case, a drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. The hunter threw up his hands and said that it was all because of the favorable payment ratio. His clone was sitting in the back seat. The protagonist smiled and added that he could trust his comrade if he didn't like something about this industry or the guild. The man's hands shook. The car drove along the highway. The CEO of JM thanked his client. There were treadmills in the gym. The athlete's bloody hands were bandaged. His pumped-up legs trembled from the strain. Number 1 was lifting a heavy barbell. The trainer bit his nail in fear. The girl approached him and asked if this man would be okay. The gym employee said that he had already tried to talk to him, but it was pointless. The clone stopped when the notification sounded. The double put the barbell on the rack. He picked up the phone. The owner asked him to finish the workout and wait for him at the entrance to the gym. The copy drank a bottle of water in one gulp. The woman put her hand to her chest and noticed that the visitor had finally finished. Her colleague was happy with this news. Slugs were crawling on the ground. They were crawling along the walls and ceiling of a deep cave. Suddenly, something hit the slug. The man was holding a large sledgehammer in his hand. The awakened one pointed a device similar to a vacuum cleaner at the slime. The capsule behind him filled almost to the brim. The hunter came out of the portal. The protagonist took off his gas mask and sighed heavily. Junmo approached him and asked how he was doing. Sanwoo replied that it was very difficult to breathe with the mask on. The man crossed his arms and explained that people usually did not come here, even though the slug area was considered safe. The boy looked at the torn glove and concluded that he could not last very long here. The young man looked around. The JM executive explained that they could hunt here until the container was full and then simply replace it in the locker. But even a person with great endurance could not last more than 6 hours here. The agent scratched his chin and said that it was possible to stay here longer if he purchased a good gas mask and higher class equipment. The student frowned and said that he could hardly last even 2 hours here, let alone 6. The awakened pointed to his clone and offered him to do it. A gas mask flew into number 2's face. The double tied the laces on his boots. He pulled on rubber gloves. The hunter clenched his fist and wished him luck as the copy went after the slugs. The protagonist turned his head and decided to head to the field with the rabbits. Sangwoo turned around to call number 1, but he was not there. The boy pouted and remembered that he forgot to pick him up from the gym. The twin was waiting patiently at the entrance to the gym. The clone raised his eyebrows. A white car stopped on the side of the road. The boy looked out the window and asked him to get in. The sun was almost setting. The student winced when Junmo asked why his client called the doppelgangers by numbers. The awakened one smiled and explained that they all looked the same, so giving them interesting names would be confusing. The man raised his eyebrows and agreed that names were not that important when it came to regular copies. The hunter frowned tensely and remembered that pistols were used to hunt horned hares, and the JM CEO confirmed this. The protagonist pouted and asked if he didn't need to prepare some equipment in that case. The agent looked away and said that he didn't need to worry about that and explained that he could use his own gun or rent the necessary items at the hunting grounds. The manager presented a bunch of different weapons and added that his client would have to get his own equipment because the rented items could only be used at the hunting grounds. Suddenly, Sangwoo opened his mouth in surprise and asked what that sound was. Junmo smiled and said that they had arrived. There was a military base at the Eugensen grounds. Soldiers were guarding the outer walls. The traffic controller was waving red batons. The guy got out of the car and remarked that this place was nothing like the slug's territory. The man pointed forward and explained that this was the famous Eugensen territory where the first monster breakthrough occurred. The young man scratched his chin and thought about what he had heard about this before. The monsters burst out of a rift in the sky. Usually the portals did not allow monsters to leave, which is why most of the hunting took place inside. The demon pounced on the man with the machine gun. In some cases they managed to pass through the barrier and destroy the surrounding area. Waves of bright energy swept around the rift. This is what is called a monster breakthrough. Standing by the car, the CEO of JM explained that 5 years had passed and most of the high-ranking monsters had been defeated, but there were still F and E rank monsters in the territory, so this place was revered by hunters. The student opened his mouth in amazement and asked if no one complained about this noise. The heroes entered the building. There were many people inside. The agent pointed to the gunsmith and said that everything you need can be rented here. A box of ammunition fell on the table. The base employee picked up a rifle and said that with night vision goggles, earplugs, and bullets, it would cost 700,000 won. Clutching a credit card, the awakened decided that this was a bit much. Waving his hand, Junmo explained that most of it was for the bullets, which would pay for themselves if they successfully hunted rabbits, and added that the price for one horn was comparable to a bucket of tears. As they went up the escalator, the man said that their place was on the 3rd floor of Building F, and the hunter asked if the area was divided into zones even inside. The CEO looked back and said that they had arrived. He covered his ears with his fingers when a loud gunshot rang out. People were sitting on the edge of the building, firing rifles. A stranger smoked cigarettes and complained about constantly missing. Another awakened held a dead rabbit in his hands. There were several carcasses in a black bag. The protagonist raised his eyebrows in surprise. The agent pointed to his place. The manager squatted down and asked if his client was sure of his shooting skills. Sangwoo pulled out a rifle and smugly confirmed it. The guy looked at the gun and said that he had only missed 3 times during the license exam. Junmo remembered that the targets there were quite close. The young man closed his eyes and said that he even felt a little sorry for the horned rabbits. The student put on earplugs. The awakened took aim and said that they would not be able to escape his eagle gaze. The man clenched his fist and was glad that everyone here had earplugs. The hunter took aim at the animal. He opened his mouth wide and shouted that he had found one. It seemed that the hare was looking straight at the sight. The protagonist slowly pulled the trigger. The cartridge case flew into the air. The hunt began. 3 hours later, night had fallen, but gunshots were still ringing out at the military base. Sonu covered his face with his hands. The boy lowered his head and realized that he hadn't hit the target even once. The young man threw his head back and declared that it didn't make sense. At that moment, the scope was pointing right at the rabbit's head. The animal raised its ears. When the shot rang out, the animal immediately ran away. The student closed his eyes and was upset that they were so fast. Not long before, the CEO of JM approached him and said that it was time for him to go. Looking at the night sky, the awakened one realized that he hadn't even recouped the cost of the bullets and decided that he'd had enough for today. Number 1 looked back when the owner called out to him. Sitting in a chair, the hunter asked him to shoot rabbits with a gun, take their bodies with a harpoon, and send him a message with the number 1 if he succeeded. The protagonist looked down in disappointment and sighed heavily. The floodlights illuminated only a small part of the area. Sangwoo decided to go home. Lying in bed, the guy looked at his status window. The young man put his hands on his chest and was glad that number 2 was doing a great job of dealing with the slugs. The student raised his eyebrows and noticed that his stats continued to rise. In the memory, Heesung approached him from behind and smirked. The awakened one closed his eyes and thought that he still had a long way to go. The hunter covered his mouth with his hand and yawned. In his mind, the horned rabbit showed him the middle finger. The protagonist decided that catching these monsters unexpectedly turned out to be a complete failure for him. He stared at the ceiling. Sanwoo closed his eyes and hoped that number one would catch at least one hair. The screen of the phone lying next to his pillow lit up. Many messages appeared on it. The phone vibrated because the clone was sending many messages with the number one. Clouds floated above the city. There were many signs on the walls of the building. Junmo looked out the window. The phone in his pants pocket vibrated. The man picked it up and said hello. Holding the phone to his ear, the CEO heard someone ask if this was the agency Hunter Sanwoo belonged to. The agent frowned and confirmed it, and the manager of the slime territory asked him to come over right away and stop his client. The manager's eyes widened in shock when he learned that the clone had been hunting for 24 hours. Junmo grabbed his jacket and said that he would come as soon as he could. The guy got up from his bed and said that he had had a really good nap. The young man looked at his phone and noticed the messages, thinking that his double had run out of bullets. Sitting in the lotus position, the student read the messages. The awakened one's eyes widened in shock and asked why there were so many of them. The hunter's mouth dropped open in amazement. The man entered the slime territory and raised his eyebrows in confusion. There were many vials of red liquid on the floor. The CEO of JM put his hand to his chin and wondered if the double had filled all the tanks in just one day. The men in hazmat suits ran up to their colleague. Blood began to flow from the holes in his gas mask. The agent immediately put the phone to his ear. The protagonist picked up the phone and asked what had happened. Smiling widely, the manager reported that his copy had filled all the slime storage facilities in 24 hours and asked him to call number 2 back as they were going to call in the cleaners. Sangwoo smiled awkwardly and asked if he could send the cleaners to Yu Jensen as well. There were dead rabbit bodies on the floor. The shocked men surrounded the pile of corpses. The guy said that it was already difficult to get through. The stranger crossed his arms over his chest and said that he couldn't even count them. Someone was filming the rabbits on a camera. Number one sat on a chair. No one could believe that he managed to catch all those rabbits by himself. Someone approached him and said that his skills were simply incredible. The man handed him a business card and introduced himself. Byeong-sik put his hand on his chest and asked if the hunter belonged to any guilds. The clone silently looked forward. The leader of the recruiting team smiled nervously and decided that he needed to be patient, since most talented people were very strange. The man behind him crossed his arms and left. There was a crowd of representatives from different guilds nearby. One of them explained that this man was not going to talk to anyone at all. The Brown Bear Guild member opened his mouth in surprise. The men began to curse. At this time, the young man placed a container next to his double. The awakened one looked up and said that these were extra bullets. There were many bullets in the box. The hunter asked the double to continue hunting and hand over the corpses to the agent. The protagonist put his hand on his shoulder and praised him for his excellent work. The twin raised his hands in joy. Number one picked up the rifle. The people around him opened their mouths in surprise when they saw that he had started hunting again. They crowded around him and decided to watch him hunt. There were many books on the shelf. Sanu realized that he had underestimated the capabilities of his clones. There were study supplies on the table. The guy thought about the fact that the doubles now receive 50% of his characteristics, which means that they must be half as weak as him. Holding a pen, the boy noticed that they were distinguished by an automatic desire to complete a task and the ability to make a decision without hesitation. The student dropped the pen when someone called out to him and asked what was wrong. Han tilted her head and asked what he was thinking about. Handing her a piece of paper, the awakened one apologized and said that her results had improved since their last meeting. The girl was happy about this but still wanted an answer to her question. The protagonist leaned on his hand and told her that he had visited the hunting grounds and that everything had gone much better than expected. The girl gaped in surprise and asked if he was a hunter. She stood up from the table and said that she did not know about it. The schoolgirl picked up the phone and asked if her teacher knew the hunter that everyone was talking about on the internet. Sanwoo asked who exactly she was talking about. The boy choked when the student showed him a video of the god of shooting, the eagle eye Yu Jensen. The boy's eyes widened in surprise and he asked who they were talking about. The video showed a pile of corpses. Hang said that everyone on the internet was going crazy because of it and that this person had already killed over 200 rabbits by the time this video was recorded, which was enough to set a new record. People were filming number one on their phones, but the clone didn't say a word when they tried to ask him questions. The double pulled on his cap and only said Eagle Eye Yu Jensen. The people around him decided that this was his nickname. The student's mouth fell open in horror. Looking at the phone, the girl said that she really dreamed of becoming a hunter. The main character asked if she had managed to wake up. The girl looked away and replied that she had received a license. but was afraid to go to hunting grounds. She pursed her lips. The schoolgirl tucked her hair behind her ear and asked if her teacher could go hunting with her if she managed to get a good grade. Sangwoo raised his eyebrows and promised to take her with him only if she could get into the university. The student smiled happily and asked if it was true. The guy confirmed it and said that he also knew some safe hunting grounds. Haeyoung raised her little finger and asked him to make her a promise. The boy smiled. The heroes hook each other's little fingers. The girl raised her eyebrows and hoped that he would not change his mind. A gust of wind lifted the curtains. The student asked his friend to continue in the same spirit, and then she would definitely be able to get into Jeongguk. After a while, someone opened the door. Haeyoung's mother turned around and opened her mouth wide. Sangwoo smiled and said that the lesson was already over. Haeyoung was eavesdropping behind the door and heard the protagonist calling her talented and saying that there was nothing to worry about. Sangwoo turned around and said that he would come on Monday. Haeyoung was sweating profusely from excitement. She immediately jumped on the bed, mentally exclaiming that they would have another meeting. The girl looked at the bright sphere and said that he was a hunter, and thanks to this, their communication went smoothly. She smiled and thought that at first she did not like this idea because he was an acquaintance of her father. She remembered his appearance. The girl remembered how he pointed his finger at the notebook and explained something. Haeyoung remembered how he smiled. She blushed deeply, thinking that he was kind, explained well, and also handsome. She lowered her head and sighed. Then the girl raised her head and exclaimed that she needed to study. After a while, night fell. The protagonist entered the shelter and wondered if they had finished collecting corpses. Director Junmo opened his mouth wide when he saw the protagonist. The protagonist approached them and asked if they were here too. Junmo raised his hand and asked him where he had been since he was supposed to be checking on the gathering, and the protagonist replied that he had been tutoring. A man picked up a monster carcass, and Junmo said that he had called the gathering team to many hunting grounds many times before. The workers were putting the monster carcasses into boxes, and Junmo said that this was the first time he had called so many people to gather horned rabbits. Indeed, there were many workers standing there, namely 352 people. Junmo crossed his arms and asked if Sangwoo had checked the settlement he had sent, and the young man picked up his phone and said that he had turned off notifications, so he hadn't seen it yet. He looked and saw that he had received over 30 million won from the agency. He opened his mouth wide and screamed. The protagonist smiled and asked if it was really supposed to be that much. Junmo widened his eyes and said that his hunting skills were above F class, so he changed the calculation to 83%, which is equivalent to E class. The protagonist put his hand to his head and thanked him. Suddenly, a man opened his mouth and called out to them. They all turned around. The man pointed his finger at him and asked if he was the manager of that worm. He pointed his finger at the clone of the protagonist. Junmo stood in front of him and asked the man who he was. The man frowned and said that he was a hunter whose prey was stolen. He looked at the machine gun and said that all the horned rabbits he aimed at were killed by him, so today's hunt was a complete failure. He grabbed his shoulder and said that he thought they should compensate him for his expenses. A drop of sweat rolled down Junmo's cheek. He put his hand on his chin and told the protagonist that they seemed to have chosen the wrong spot, and the protagonist said that he didn't know there were people like that. He put his hand on his chin and thought about it. The protagonist looked at him and said that he had an idea. The man frowned and wondered with displeasure what they were whispering about. He extended his hand and said that he had a conscience, and therefore he only wanted 10% of the profits. The protagonist's mouth opened wide. The stranger frowned and asked why he was laughing. Sangwoo put his hand on his clone's shoulder and said that the guy wouldn't be coming for a few days. He then pointed to the side and told Mr. Junmo that they needed to go, but the man started yelling angrily. They passed him and the protagonist asked why they didn't go sit at the coffee shop on the corner. The stranger grinned terribly in anger. He raised his hand and shouted for Sangwoo not to ignore him. The protagonist frowned and number one's eyes lit up. His fist was right in the clone's face. The man punched the protagonist's clone. The clone flew back from the punch. It hit several boxes like a ball. Eventually, it hit the wall and stopped. Blood started coming out of number one's mouth. The man opened his mouth wide and shouted that he hadn't hit him that hard. Sangwoo was holding his phone and shouting about how cruel the man was. He opened his mouth wide and started talking about how this was an act of violence on a sacred hunting ground, so people wouldn't let it go that easily. The stranger looked around and was very worried. The protagonist closed his eyes and exclaimed that it would be really bad if this video leaked online, while at the same time, he thought that it would be shocking news. The man frowned and lowered his head. The protagonist showed him the video. The man stood with his head down, and Sangwoo suggested that they part ways on good terms. The man suddenly bared his teeth and finally resigned himself to it. After a while, they were sitting in a cafe. The protagonist opened his eyes wide and asked about the Heesung Guild. Junmo pointed and said that he thought the hunter who attacked him today belonged to that guild. The clone was also sitting next to them, and Junmo said that since the Heesung Guild is huge, all kinds of people gather there. The protagonist extended his hand and asked how Junmo knew that the man was from the Hisung Guild. The agent remembered the man sitting behind him, and so he said that the hunter had been keeping an eye on him ever since he came to collect the corpses. A tear rolled down his cheek and he became worried about something. The protagonist frowned and said that he understood that they might want revenge. Junmo closed his eyes and said that they did this because they thought that his clone was another hunter who had made a contract with them. Even before that, the hunters of the JM agency were being bullied. Sangwoo drank juice while the agent was talking about how they did not stay with them for long and everyone was leaving. At the moment, only a few F-class hunters remained, including the protagonist. He lowered his head and said that even now, he cannot promise that there will be no more problems from the Hisun Guild. The protagonist handed over a glass and asked not to force him to change his mind, because he already knew everything, but he still joined, so Junmo does not need to worry. A drop of sweat rolled down the man's cheek. Sangwoo widened his eyes and said that he will not let them get away with this. Then the protagonist smiled and said that he has a plan to become stronger in a short time. He raised his hands and began to talk. Junmo looked at him in surprise. They continued to sit at the table and discuss the plan. After a while, the protagonist smiled and asked Junmo what he thought about it. The man put his hand to his chin and said that he had never thought about it. He started writing something in a notebook and said that he was free tomorrow afternoon. He suggested meeting at a hunter's shop. There were many hunters in the building. The trade in weapons, armor and other items for hunting was from the very beginning. Many hunters were walking around the shop. These department stores got into the hunting industry, taking over a large part of the market. Thanks to this, you can find everything you can imagine here. The protagonist put on the armor. The consultant extended his hand and said that this protective gear is made of titanium. It will provide the protagonist with guaranteed protection from E-class monsters. Sangwoo smiled and said that the armor is quite light and comfortable, so he likes it. He picked up a knife. Sangwoo tested his sharpness and said that he would be mastering pistols, so he thought that was enough. He turned around and asked the consultant to give him 2 more sets of weapons and armor. After a while, he was holding a suitcase with equipment in his hands. Junmo looked at him and reminded him that the protagonist also said that he needed skills. The protagonist looked away and said that he was looking for familiar skills, although he was not sure if there was one here. Then they entered a store. There was a shiny sphere on the table. The protagonist looked at the display case. He looked at the sphere and happily exclaimed that this was what he was looking for. The protagonist looked at the description of this item, which allows the hunter to share his senses and vision with the creatures and pets he summoned. However, this item costs about 131. The protagonist covered his eyes with his hand. He waved his hands and said that he thought it was time to take their relationship to the next level. Junmo looked at his phone and said that he wasn't sure if it was enough, but he thought he could lend the protagonist 50 million won right now. The protagonist smiled and said that he thought he could handle the rest. He looked at the sphere again and told him not to worry. In the reflection, he could see Sangwoo's face, saying that if things didn't go as planned, they would recoup their investment in no time. After a while, he put the items on the floor. Sangwoo was reading the instructions. He opened his eyes wide and said that he needed to pour mana into the sphere, and for users who couldn't control the mana, he needed to turn on the sphere while keeping it in contact with their body. The protagonist picked up a remote control and wondered if it was a power button. He placed his hand on the sphere. His face was tense and his hand was shaking. Sangwoo closed his eyes and pressed the button. A bright light lit up the room. Nothing could be seen because of the strong light, and after a moment, the system notified him that a new level 1 skill had been created. Sangwoo looked at his hands in shock. Then he looked to the side and found that the skill ball had disappeared. The youth clenched his fists and mentally said that the skill was now ready to use. He knelt down and ordered the clones to come over. The clones began to walk towards him. They were dressed in the armor that Sangwoo had bought for them. The protagonist looked at them and said that it was time for them to go. After a while, Sangwoo raised his hands and asked Junmo what he thought of the results of the hunt. Junmo raised his hand and said that of course everything went great, and he did not expect such a result. The protagonist frowned and said that like him, the endurance, agility, and clones were only half his capabilities, but one of them killed more than 300 rabbits. A man punched the clone in the face. The clone flew back, and the protagonist mentally said that he had ordered the clone to get hit and suffer from it in the most dramatic way. Besides, it is not that easy to calculate the timing perfectly and fearlessly put your face in front of a punch. The protagonist looked at Junmo and said that he thought that the man could actually punch the clone in the face if he wanted to. Junmo widened his eyes and asked if Sangwoo was saying that despite their low stats, they were able to control them better. The protagonist gave a thumbs up and said that he would take advantage of this. He gave 2 fingers and said that they needed to visit 2 places first. He started talking about a training ground where he was going to learn long-range and close-range attacks using weapons. A man in a kimono looked at them and happily asked if they really came to register. The man in the cap smiled and exclaimed that he would now prepare everything for them to learn how to shoot. 2 clones also walked with the protagonist and trained. The two men looked at them in shock, because in the first case they decided to immediately move on to sparring, and in the shooting range they immediately wanted to pick up a gun and start shooting. The man knocked the stick out of the sparring partner's hands and said that they needed to attack the hands so that the opponent would drop the stick. Then the man turned around and asked if he was a hunter, but did he really want to fight right away. The shooting instructor took his cap in his hand and asked if they knew what clay pigeon shooting was and if they were sure they wanted to take a gun. The clones frowned and said that they were sure of it. The second one held sticks in his hands, and the first one held a real gun. The man picked up the remote control and said that they were starting. The trainer in the kimono held his hand out in front of them and started the countdown. And so one of them began to fight, and the second one began to shoot at the clay pigeons from the shooting range. The second one hit the bald man with a stick. The first clone hit the plate and it shattered into pieces. The coach's eyes widened in surprise. The shooting instructor looked up in shock. The second clone held sticks in his hands. The first one held a gun. Sanwoo was drinking juice at the table and talking about how he needed the familiar skill. Junmo's eyes widened in shock and he wondered. The agent looked at the protagonist in surprise and asked if this wasn't a skill for sharing vision with a pet, and Sanwoo replied that it wasn't just for that. He pointed and said that it was important that all senses were combined, including smell and touch. The protagonist stood in front of several tin cans while thinking about how he could use this skill while his clones were training in fighting or shooting. Sanwoo sighed. He closed his eyes and activated the skill. A blue aura appeared around him. Everything around him darkened and he thought that he could experience everything. Meanwhile, the first clone was fighting. A bald man was running towards him. The second one frowned. Then he immediately lowered his head back and dodged the blow, and the protagonist said that he could feel the angle of the joints and the balance of the body. The clone dodged back. Then the clone raised his head, and the protagonist felt the movement of each muscle and the flow of power. Meanwhile, the first clone took out a gun. He pointed it forward, and the protagonist felt the aim in the direction of the gaze. The clone fired. The plate appeared in the sky. The bullet broke the plate into pieces. A blue aura emanated from Sanwoo. His eyes were closed. Then he closed his eyes. The protagonist smiled and said that he could have all of this. The aura was still raging around him. He looked at his hand. Sanwoo lowered his head and thought about the experience he had just had. He remembered the air pressure when a stick flies past. He also thought about the smell of gunpowder and the force of the recoil. His hand was shaking. He felt tired. He imagined himself as if he were a puppet and thought that, of course, he did not move a muscle. All the work was done for him by his clones, and he only shared their feelings. The protagonist imagined how to aim and mentally said that he experienced the movements of clones who had the same body as him. Sanu looked at his hand and thought that he could imitate these movements right now. Then the system notified him that his strength and reaction speed had increased. The protagonist warmed up his hands and said that today he would try sparring and shooting. He closed his eyes and activated the skill. A blue aura appeared around him. The action moves to the gym. The clone of the protagonist is holding sticks in his hands. A man in a kimono is standing opposite him. The protagonist frowned and realized that this man looked strong. The men around them looked at them and were surprised that the trainer was going to spar with the newbie himself. They stood opposite each other. Then the protagonist knocked one of the sticks out of his hands. He struck from above. The man frowned and parried the attacks and thought that the clone's attacks did not feel experienced. It seemed that he was not used to sticks. The clone dodged the attack, and so the man realized that defense was a completely different matter because he predicted his movements and perfectly dodged his attacks. The man raised his hand up. He struck with the stick, but the clone blocked the attack. The clone looked at him from below. Then he immediately swung his hand. They crossed sticks and the clone looked at him closely. The man frowned and thought that this attack was quite strong. The clone immediately copied his fighting style. The coach frowned and looked at him. He hit the clone from above, but he dodged. The men opened their mouths wide in surprise. The clone immediately swung his stick. He hit the coach in the chest. The coach bared his teeth in pain. He turned around and realized that he had hit a wall. The protagonist raised his hand above himself and was about to attack. For some reason, the coach smiled. He immediately bounced off the wall and found himself in the air. The protagonist opened his eyes in shock. The coach hit him in the arm and broke his sticks. The man frowned and looked down. Everyone around smiled and said that their coach was no slouch either, but it was a very close fight. The protagonist cried from the pain in his wrist. The coach smiled and said that it was dangerous. He held out the stick and asked if the protagonist wanted to continue. A drop of sweat rolled down Sen's cheek and he asked the clone if he was okay. The clone lowered his head. In an instant, he was right above the coach. All the men in the room opened their mouths wide in surprise. The coach also opened his mouth wide. The protagonist looked down and asked if he wanted to continue. The protagonist knelt down. He then stood up and picked up the stick and said that he wanted another fight. The coach closed his eyes and agreed to it. The protagonist looked ahead and said that it was time to switch to numbers 2. A blue aura appeared around number 1. In an instant, the plate shattered into pieces. A man smiled and braggingly asked his girlfriend if she saw what he did. The girl smiled happily and exclaimed that he was very cool. The protagonist frowned and thought about not saying anything. Sanu looked at the second clone in shock and mentally said that the clone was even shooting at the targets of the person behind him. He opened his eyes wide and realized that he needed to concentrate on shooting. The plate was in the air. The clone raised his gun, and the protagonist thought about fixing the position of his upper body. He aimed and thought about not moving and turning only in the direction of movement, following the trajectory of the plate. The plate was already in the sights, and Sanu thought about when the target and the expected trajectory converged, he needed to shoot. The plate shattered into pieces. Smoke came out of the barrel of the gun. The clone raised his head and looked at the broken plate. It crumbled into pieces and fell, and Sanu mentally said that he needed to remember every little detail. He opened his eyes wide and looked at the falling fragments, thinking that he must learn everything his clones are capable of. After a while, the sunset came. The blue aura was coming from Sangwoo. The protagonist opened his eyes. He wiped the sweat from his chin and said that switching between the first and second clone was tiring. His vision started to blur. He covered his face with his hand and thought that his mana had run out and he was feeling tired, so he needed to rest. The protagonist was breathing heavily. He sat down on the bench and started thinking that the clones' movements were just crazy, and they didn't doubt or fear anything at all, so they moved as they needed to, and Sangwoo could feel the wind when the clone dodged the stick. He looked into the distance and thought that next time he would go with them, because he should see what would happen if he tried it himself. Meanwhile, someone was walking towards him. A girl looked at the protagonist. The protagonist's eyes widened when he heard the girl call him teacher. Haeyoung was standing in front of him. He opened his mouth wide and asked what she was doing here so late, and the girl replied that she was studying at the library. Several bandits were looking at them from behind, while the protagonist and the girl were chatting pleasantly. The man was smoking a cigarette and smiling. The three of them were frowning and looking at the protagonist. A man was holding a phone in his hands. The man frowned and began to apologize to the interlocutor, saying that he wanted to scare Jummo a little, but it turned out that their conversation was being recorded. A drop of sweat rolled down his forehead, because the interlocutor asked if his threats were really recorded. He lowered his head and shouted that he would find out everything, but the interlocutor reminded him not to say anything here and just not to go near the territory of Yu Jensen. The man was illuminated by the yellow rays of the sun. His interlocutor told him not to say that he is connected with the Heesun Guild. The man turned red with anger when the other person said that the man should call himself a simple street hooligan. He smashed the phone against the wall. The man started screaming. He started kicking the phone. Suddenly, he turned around because he heard someone ask him why he was angry again. The man in front of him was smiling and saying that he hadn't seen him for a long time. Hyun-seok smiled widely and looked at the man and then asked what happened. 3 cigarette butts were lying on the ground. The 3 of them stood in front of each other and Hyun-seok asked if the man did nothing and just let them go. Hyun-seok took the cigarette in his hand and said that he knew it would be like this when the man was happy to join the first guild in the country. The man looked down and said that the guild told him not to go near the Yu Jangsan territory. Hyun-seok looked at the long-haired man and told him to find some part-time work. The man then looked into the distance. He saw Sangwoo sitting on a bench. He immediately extended his hand and pointed at the protagonist, exclaiming that he was the one who recorded him on video. He immediately walked towards him, but Jun-seok ordered him to calm down. The man was holding onto the corner of the wall. He was watching the protagonist from around the corner and was very angry. They were looking at Sangwoo, who was happily chatting with Haeyoung. The girl looked at the protagonist and asked him what he was doing there, and he replied that he was just training. Then they both looked away, because someone called out to them. The man was walking towards them and was talking about how their little brother owed the protagonist something. Jun-seok was walking towards him, smiling. A drop of sweat rolled down the protagonist's cheek and he said that he had no idea who these people were. He saw that man grinning angrily. He widened his eyes and immediately remembered what was going on. The protagonist stood up and asked them what he could do to help them. The man frowned deeply. He opened his mouth wide and started to shout, but Jun-seok smiled and asked him to calm down. Jun-seok smiled creepily and said that he heard that the protagonist had a video of his little brother making a mistake due to his emotions. A drop of sweat rolled down the protagonist's cheek, and Jun-seok suggested that they delete the video and disperse peacefully. He held out his phone and asked if they would really let him go if he deleted the video, and Jun-seok also held out his hand and said that he didn't like doing tedious work either. The protagonist's hand began to shake. Jun-seok lowered his head when the protagonist asked if there was a guarantee that they would really do that. The man smiled. He put his hand to his chin and said that Sangwoo was smart, because he really wouldn't leave here without getting beaten. Sangwoo hung his head and Jun-seok said that he was not smart enough to delete the video right after he took it, so now it makes no difference. Haeyoung opened her mouth wide in excitement because the protagonist quietly told her to run as soon as she had the chance. The bandit had already started to stretch his arms. The protagonist frowned and mentally said that he did not think he would be in a difficult situation so soon. He got into a fighting stance and said that he would beat them all up. The bandit pointed at him and laughed, saying that he was quite confident in himself. The two men ran towards the protagonist, and Jun-seok stood behind them, telling them to beat the boy up good. Sang-woo dodged a punch, then he dodged another punch. The man kicked him. The protagonist bared his teeth and flew back. Then he was hit on the chin. Haeyoung opened her mouth wide and started screaming his name. Sang-woo fell to the ground. Blood came out of his mouth and he started to get up, thinking about how it didn't work the first time. He was lying on the ground behind Haeyoung. The girl had materialized some kind of sphere. She held the sphere in front of her and shouted at them to step back. Sang-woo bared his teeth as he looked at her. His eyes widened in surprise. The girl was shaking in fear. The men looked at her in shock and wondered if she was really awakened. Hyun-seok hit them on the back of the head and asked in displeasure if they were scared of a schoolgirl. Haeyoung held the sphere in front of her. Hyun-seok smiled and asked what would happen if they continued to advance. She opened her mouth wide and shouted at them to step back. Hyun-seok went at her. She bared her teeth. Haeyoung shot the sphere at them. The ball flew into the man's stomach area. In a moment, everything was in a fog. The men covered their faces with their hands. Everything around was in a fog. The bandit's smile was visible through the fog, and he also said that the awakened were now like stones on the road. His t-shirt had burned off and his tattooed body was revealed, and then he said that there was nothing to brag about. He immediately raised his hand and told Haeyoung to grow up. The protagonist immediately blocked the punch. He frowned at the bandit and said that it was not over yet. Sang-woo punched him back. The man's hand relaxed. Haeyoung's mouth opened wide in surprise. The protagonist bared his teeth. Jun-seok grabbed his face and stepped back. The protagonist was in a fighting stance. He bared his teeth and thought that he was starting to understand that it was not enough to copy the clan's movements. The man swung his fist, and Sang-woo thought that looking at his shoulder, he should move in advance to avoid being hit. The young man dodged and thought about how a punch was not just about swinging his arms. He imagined the structure of the muscles and mentally said that the momentum goes from the legs to the waist. He swung and thought that the momentum then goes from the waist to the arm. The protagonist made a powerful punch. Another bandit attacked him from the side and he realized that he couldn't avoid it and the bandit would hit him. The protagonist took the blow and attacked back. The bandit fell to the ground and Sang-woo was still in a stance. He started breathing heavily. Jun-seok smiled and asked if he really knew how to fight. His eyes glowed red and he said that he was hesitant about hitting someone who couldn't even swing his fists. Sang-woo stood in a stance and thought that he still felt the pain from the last fight. The young man blocked his attack and thought that he was able to withstand it then. But if Jun-seok was so strong, did he really have a skill related to enhancing muscle strength? The protagonist clenched his fists and mentally exclaimed that he couldn't let him hit him just like that. Jun-seok ran at him, smiling. The protagonist hit him back. Then he hit him again. The thug closed his eyes and called the protagonist a name. He then immediately reached out to him. The young man punched the thug in the face, thinking that he needed to hit him hard and knock him out. Jun-seok swung his hand, but Sang-woo ducked and dodged. He then threw a powerful uppercut. The other thug looked at them while lying on the ground. Sang-woo's eyes widened in surprise. Jun-seok grinned widely, and his face seemed to glow. The veins on his arms glowed. The thug swung his arm and said that Sang-woo was a corpse. Bino-sha stood his ground and thought that he needed to dodge such a swing. However, suddenly, his leg was grabbed. The protagonist lowered his head and saw the thug holding his leg. The protagonist smiled and raised his head, realizing that he was caught. Jun-seok hit him and he fell. He opened his mouth wide and exhaled all the air that was in his lungs. Haeyoung began to cry and scream. The protagonist hit his back against the pole. He knelt down and clutched his chest, thinking about how hard it was. He lowered his head, trying to breathe, and Jun-seok continued to mock him. The boy was clutching his chest and breathing heavily. He looked at him with a frown. Jun-seok took a wide swing and was about to hit, and the protagonist thought that this was the end. Everything around him became foggy. Jun-seok opened his mouth and groaned in pain. The protagonist looked up in shock. Haeyoung attacked him with her ability. Two bandits were lying on the ground and cursing. They ran at her, and the protagonist shouted that she should have run. Sang-woo's clones immediately dealt with the remaining two bandits. Haeyoung's mouth opened in surprise. She looked at the second clone. Jun-seok turned around and wondered what was going on. The protagonist raised his hand. He wiped the blood off his lip and said that he could finally breathe. Sang-woo clenched his fist and Jun-seok started yelling at him. The boy smiled and looked at him. He then jumped off the wall and landed in the air. He looked down at him and thanked him for the practical test. Then Sang-woo kicked him and he fell. After a while, the boy was sitting up and trying to catch his breath. Jun Seok was unconscious. The other bandit was also lying on the ground, and the system notified the protagonist that he had gained muscle strength and endurance and that his cloning skill had been raised to level 3. The protagonist smiled while looking out the system window. He then raised his head. Haeyoung and the clones were running towards him because the protagonist lay down and closed his eyes. Night had fallen. The girl wrapped bandages around her arms and the protagonist asked her why she didn't run away when she had time. She turned around and said that she didn't think that was what he wanted to say. Haeyoung's eyes widened and she said that she was really surprised and still couldn't believe that the famous rookie hunter was a clone of Sangwoo. She remembered how the first clone stood in front of the protagonist. The boy put his hand to his chin and asked her not to tell anyone about this. Haeyoung blushed and looked at him and said that she understood and would keep her mouth shut. They then walked to her house. She turned around and winked at him, saying that only her left hand was hurt and therefore it was okay since she would be able to hold a pen. She looked away and said that since his student was hurt, why didn't he reduce the amount of homework? But Sangwoo replied that she had finished everything in the study room. The girl looked down and said that he only had a good memory for this kind of thing. Sangwoo grabbed his neck and thanked her. He smiled and looked at her and said that he thought he was able to win because she delayed the enemy. The girl blushed and closed her eyes, then exclaimed that she had played an important role today. Haeyoung frowned and said that thank you alone would not fill her stomach, so he could thank her when they ate meat. She raised her finger and asked him to promise her that. After a while, the girl raised her hand and said that she was going home. The protagonist smiled and promised that he would do everything to feed her meat until she was full. Then they turned around and walked home. The protagonist turned around and looked at the clones. He asked them why they were following him since they had to work hard, but they replied that it was late so all the training centers were closed. The protagonist picked up a stick. He gave them a stick and said that they could train in the park. The action takes place at night, a month later. Junmo called the protagonist and asked him about how the plane was going. The protagonist sat near the clones and said that now even he can shoot at plates and his cloning skill level has also increased, so he has a third clone. Junmo raised his head and congratulated him, noting that he will be able to learn even faster now. The protagonist smiled and said that Junmo will be surprised when he sees his stats. The man's mouth opened wide in surprise when Sanwoo asked if it would be possible to request 3 F-class hunting territories for tomorrow. Sanwoo closed his eyes and asked if it would be difficult, and Junmo replied that he would get them no matter what. Junmo wrote something in his journal and asked about the time, and the protagonist said that he would send the clones to train in the morning and then to the hunting territory in the afternoon. The protagonist hung up and looked at the clones. He pointed at each one with his finger and gave each one a different task. The clones started running out of the room, and the protagonist yelled at them to come home before noon. They picked up their weapons, but Sanu ordered them to leave them at home. Sometime later, the young man was watching a video on how to hunt monsters. He sat in front of the screen and thought about what he saw from the clones' training. That they were good at learning, able to copy and reproduce almost any movement, provided that it was physically possible. His eyes widened and he wondered what would happen if he studied all the monsters and how to hunt them properly. He watched the video while sitting at the table. Sometime later, it was morning. 3 men were walking around the room. The protagonist looked at them with displeasure and asked if it was already noon. He then pointed and ordered them to take a shower and go eat. The clones started changing clothes, and the protagonist thought about how he had reviewed the guides for most of the F-class monsters, and now he needed to check if they could follow these instructions. The protagonist imagined the progress chart of the hunt in his head and mentally said that he would monitor and gain hunting experience with the familiar skill. And during the break he would study mana, plus since the familiar skill consumes a lot of mana, he would not be able to maintain it for long. He took out his phone and said that Mr. Agent Junmo would be coming soon. The 3 clones were sitting at the table eating, and the protagonist ordered them to get ready as soon as they finished eating. The 4 of them left the house to meet the agent. Junmo looked at them in shock and said that they had become quite scary, and Sanwoo said that even he felt uncomfortable around them. Junmo crossed his arms and said that the territories were ready, plus he had reserved 3 places not far from each other. The clones got into the car, and then Junmo asked if Sanwoo was coming. He smiled and said that he would participate with his familiar skill and he needed to train his mana breathing technique, so he wanted Junmo to just bring the clones to the hunting grounds and report. Okay, and they arrived. Smoke began to come out of the car's exhaust pipe. The protagonist put his hands on his hips and said that it was his turn. He opened his mouth and began to inhale slowly. A faint blue aura was emanating from him, and he thought about relaxing his body and concentrating on his feelings, as well as ignoring sounds and concentrating on himself. He closed his eyes and thought about how he felt when using a skill. The protagonist imagined a raging aura and mentally said that when using the familiar or cloning skills, he felt as if energy was coming out of his body. He closed his eyes and mentally said that the energy he felt that time was circulating in his body. A faint aura was emanating from him. He felt as if there was a core in the center of his chest. This core seemed to have grown. His eyes widened in shock, because the system notified him that he had received a meditation skill that increased some of his stats. The scene shifts and we see corpses lying on the ground and monsters running around. A man crawls to the side and wonders what these monsters are doing here. The man cries and says that this is an F-class dungeon and they just came to hunt alien fish and that monster shouldn't be here. Suddenly, a monster with a terrifying mouth bit the alien fish. This monster bared its sharp fangs. It was holding some kind of sword in its hands. The man's eyes widened in surprise. He saw himself in the reflection. This terrifying monster was behind him, and so he began to cry and scream in fear. Blood splattered to the sides and a shrill death scream was heard. Someone opened the car door. Junmo stood near the car and said that this was the last hunting ground. He looked at the third clone and said that an alien fish with strong jaws lived here. Number 3 raised his head and looked at the building. Junmo picked up the phone and thought that he should send a message now since he had delivered all 3 of them. He frowned and said in his mind that one hunter in 3 different places was really an incredible ability, and Sanu himself was sitting in his room. The third clone walked past the guards, and Junmo thought that depending on the results of this hunt, there might be an uproar in the hunter industry. Meanwhile, Sanwoo was emitting an aura and shouting that he was a genius for getting the mana breathing skill so quickly. He then sat down in dissatisfaction, since the instructor on the phone said that he shouldn't let the meditation and mana breathing skills that had appeared confuse him. He scratched his head and said that it seemed like it wasn't that easy to get the skill he needed. He picked up the phone and said that the clones must have reached their places. Sanwoo closed his eyes and an aura appeared around him, and he activated the familiar skill. One of the clones stabbed the rat with a knife. The protagonist opened his mouth wide and screamed. The clone wiped the blood from the knife on his hand, and the rat in front of him fell to the floor. The protagonist looked calmly at the clone and realized that the clone had no problems. Suddenly, more rats came running. A drop of sweat rolled down the protagonist's cheek and he thought that he would soon find out if the guide helped him. He remembered the man holding a white cloth and saying that giant rats are the most annoying F-class monsters. The man put on his glasses and said that in order to hunt them, it is better to gather in a group. The man took off his glasses and said that if a solo sortie is inevitable, there are other ways to deal with them. The clone immediately took out a gun, remembering that the man said that since they were running straight ahead, you can just keep your distance and shoot at them. He really started shooting at the rats. One rat jumped on him from above. A bullet wound was visible in the rat's skull. The clone immediately stabbed the monster in the spine with a knife. The rat fell to the floor. The crowd of rats looked at the clone with red eyes. The man put his hand to his glasses and said that if the hero gets good at it, it will be an easy source of experience points. Another man was dragging the rat's body on himself, and the man continued to say that it is not so easy to hit a moving object. The clone raised the gun in front of him. The shell flew into the air. The rat's spine was broken. Another clone was walking among some strange rocks. Suddenly, something rose from under the ground. A scorpion appeared in front of the clone. The monster immediately received a blow. The clone stood on the scorpion with a knife in his hands. The clone cut the monster, and the protagonist thought about how he could test their experience with the help of the familiar skill. The third clone was fighting against the alien fish, and the protagonist was thinking that as his stats increased, the clones would also become stronger. The first clone's eyes were glowing. The second was riding a dead scorpion, and the third was fighting against the fish, while the protagonist was thinking that he would suck everything out of the F-class monster fields today. The man walked forward. They looked at each other and wondered why it was so quiet here today, and the other said that they should have met at least a few monsters by now. A rat appeared from the shadows. They found many corpses and were stunned by how long these corpses had been lying there. It became light around and they started shouting that they needed to quickly pack the corpses into a box. Meanwhile, the sun was shining all around. The third clone was holding a knife in his hands, and behind him lay an alien fish. The protagonist looked away with displeasure, thinking that he seemed to have missed something. Suddenly, he opened his mouth wide and screamed. He opened his eyes wide and remembered that they had not collected a single corpse. The clones were standing in place, and the protagonist ordered them to go back and collect all the corpses of the monsters they had killed and not resume hunting until they had collected them all in a box. Sanwoo began to cry and looked away, wondering what to do if someone had already collected the corpses. Suddenly, he looked away. He pointed at the monsters and said that he saw corpses of alien fish there, but the clone said that he did not hunt them. The protagonist grinned angrily and said that every corpse was money, and therefore there was no time to act like a saint. He stood in front of the fish corpses. The protagonist grinned and said that if number 3 had not killed them, he had no idea what kind of monster had cut them into pieces like that. The clone fiddled with the blood. He looked at his hand and said that it was not an alien fish. Sanu's eyes widened in horror. He saw a severed human hand on the ground. He turned around and saw a monster running through the bushes. The clone immediately picked up a weapon and Sanu realized that there was something here. The blue sky was shining above him. Suddenly, he looked to the side, hearing some noise. A fish head fell to the ground. A terrifying monster stood behind the clone. He tried to turn around immediately. The monster cut off the clone's hand. He lowered his head and began to think that he was in pain. The clone grinned viciously. Sanu took his hand and began to scream in pain. He opened his eyes and screamed. The protagonist, with his mouth open, looked at his hand. His hand was shaking violently. He sat down near the refrigerator in the kitchen. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek and he thought that the connection was broken without warning due to pain. He picked up the phone and said that now was not the time for that. Junmo answered the call and the protagonist asked about which hunting ground he brought number 3 to. Junmo looked away and said that he brought the third clone to the sewage treatment plant in Iken. The youth put on his boots and asked the agent to bring the other 2 clones there immediately. He frowned and said that there was some problem with the hunt. The third clone stood with his arm cut off. The sword in the monster's hands glowed red. The clone began to fall. It fell to the ground in front of the huge monster. The protagonist extended his hand. He got out of the taxi. The youth opened his mouth slightly, looking into the distance. He saw a huge sewage treatment building in front of him. He frowned, realizing that the connection with number 3 was cut off. He opened the system window and saw that he would have to wait more than 6 more hours before the skill would recharge. The guard at the entrance asked him to show his identification bracelet. The protagonist entered and saw Junmo and was happy. There were 2 clones standing behind the agent. He stood in front of Junmo and told him that number 3 had disappeared. There was another monster on the site besides the alien fish, and it was also very strong. The protagonist put his hand on his chin and said that this monster had the head of a fish, but a body with arms and legs. Junmo's eyes widened. He extended his hand and said that they should alert the authorities and temporarily close this place down because this monster was called a fishman. He introduced this terrifying monster and said that this monster was a D rank. Even a group of E-class hunters were not enough to hunt this monster. Sangwoo put his hand on his chin and asked Junmo to alert the authorities and block the entrance to the other hunters, but not yet. Junmo looked at him in shock because the protagonist said that he wanted his clones to go through the portal. The protagonist grabbed his neck and said that they couldn't sit and wait. He looked up and said that he wanted Agent Junmo to trust him. The man grinned tensely, and Sanwoo said that he wanted Junmo to trust him just like he trusted his clones. The protagonist sat up and an aura appeared around him as he activated the skill. And so, the clones found themselves in the hunting area. They were walking through a dense forest. One of them took a gun in his hands, and Sanwoo said that they should first go to the place where number 3 disappeared. They walked through the forest, holding the gun in their hands. The second clone raised his fist. He saw the sharp mouth of a monster. The monster was eating fish not far from them. The first clone looked forward, and Sanwoo mentally said that he didn't think he would be so lucky because he had the opportunity to attack first. He looked at the monster from behind and said that its stats were equal to E-class, but his clones only had 53% of his strength, and therefore they were on the verge of F-class. He looked at the monster's bloody back and said that right now the monster was not in the best shape either. He frowned, saying that considering his clone's hunting abilities, the task was doable. The clones crouched and began to aim, and Sanwoo ordered them to aim for the head. After a moment, they began to shoot. The bullets flew off the monster's head. The clones opened their mouths in shock. The protagonist also opened his mouth wide and wondered if the bullets didn't work. The monster raised its head and began to scream. It immediately jumped into the air. The clones jumped back and dodged the attack. Then one of them swung his hand. He stabbed the monster in the head with a knife. Only a scratch was left on the monster's neck. His eyes widened and he wondered if the sword had left only a scratch. The monster immediately turned around. The sword hit a tree and missed the clone. The second clone behind him shot the monster in the back, and he thought about how he was big, so it would be awkward for him to swing his sword in the middle of the trees, and the protagonist said that he was big. The monster's sword got stuck in a tree. The monster cut the tree down with a stronger blow. Sanwoo gave a thumbs up and mentally exclaimed that he should forget about what he just said. The tree fell to the ground. The monster was standing with his back to them. The clones ran after him. The monster was holding a sword in his hands, and their attacks did not cause significant damage to him. The clones ran behind and realized that it was not working. The monster clenched his fist and prepared to attack. One of the clones flew into a tree, and Sanwoo wondered how they could hunt this monster if their attacks were so ineffective. The clone widened his eyes and remembered the bullets from a while ago. He remembered that one bullet flew off, but the second did little damage. He aimed his gun and thought about what would happen if he shot at the same place again. The bullet hit the monster and it screamed in pain. The protagonist opened his mouth and exclaimed that he succeeded. The protagonist smiled and ordered the clones to feed the monster lead. The monster ran towards them. The clones continued to shoot at it and dodge while it tried to hit them. The monster covered its face with its hand. There was blood all around. It was holding a sword in its hands. This sword seemed to be burning. The monster's eyes turned very red. It swung the sword and almost hit the protagonist's clone. The clone blocked the attack with its hands. However, it flew back because the blow was too strong. Blood came out of the clone's mouth, and Sanwoo thought that the monster had suddenly become stronger. The monster continued to fight against the second clone. Sanwoo looked at the monster's sword and thought that the reason was this sword, because the sword reacts to the monster's blood. The protagonist grinned and thought that this also meant that the fishman was pretty badly injured, so maybe it was a temporary buff. The first clone hit him and stabbed him. However, the monster attacked him and threw him back. Then he stabbed the clone with his sword. The clone's eyes widened in pain. He grabbed the monster's arm. Then he picked up a knife and said that he knew this would not end well. He swung the knife and shouted that if blood was to be spilled, it would flow harder from the monster. He began stabbing the monster multiple times. The monster swung its arm. The clone continued slashing at him with the knife. He frowned deeply because he was furious. The monster clenched its jaw as well. He raised his leg and was about to attack with his foot. The clone flew back from the kick. He grabbed his stomach. The monster swung his sword. The second clone came to the rescue and blocked. The two of them ran forward. The monster stood in front of them and they ran in different directions. They attacked the monster with knives from both sides. Blood came out of the fishman's mouth. He raised his head and started to groan in pain. Then he fell to his knees. The monster fell to the ground, unconscious, and a pool of blood formed around him. The clone looked forward tiredly. The clone fell to the ground, and the protagonist mentally said that he could not take another step. Then he looked at the gun and said that there were no more bullets, and therefore hunting was over for today. He looked to the side and said that he felt like he was about to die, and therefore he needed to inform Mr. Junmo. He saw bloody footprints of the monster leading to the side. His eyes widened in surprise. He turned around and ordered the second clone to follow the footprints. He lay on the ground and looked at the pool of blood, thinking that there was a portal in that direction. A soldier outside was saying that they had received a report of a D-class monster in the hunting area, so entry was close to hunters. The hunter began to argue discontentedly, saying that he had been gathering a team for so long, but the soldier said that hunters from the association would be arriving here soon, so they would report any changes later. Junmo watched this from the side and mentally asked the protagonist to hurry up. Suddenly, he heard someone screaming from the side. The soldiers were standing by the portal and shouting that they needed to gather forces and inform their boss. The monster was running towards the portal. It ran with its mouth wide open and screaming. The soldiers started shooting at it. The monster's sword had already caught fire. It hit one of the soldiers through the portal. A clone of the protagonist immediately emerged from the bushes. It was holding a knife in its hands. It threw the knife at the monster's back. The projectile hit the monster's head. A moment later, Sanu himself appeared in the air. He frowned and mentally exclaimed that he should hit with all his strength. Then he slashed the knife at the monster's head. Blood began to splatter and the soldiers watched in shock. The protagonist stabbed the knife into the monster's head. The soldiers' mouths opened wide in surprise. The monster fell to the ground. The first clone cried and gave a thumbs up, saying that it was really cool. A man was talking on the phone and said that they had arrived. He was looking ahead and saying that he would send a detailed report to his superiors after investigating. He looked at his comrades in front. On the floor, he saw the corpse of a monster. He lowered his head and wondered if it was a fishman. One soldier looked at him and asked if he was from the association, and he asked what happened here. The military man looked at him and said that the information about a D-class monster appearing here was true, but it had already been dealt with by a hunter who entered the territory before the portal closed. The man looked at him and said that this was an F-class hunting territory, so he did not understand what a D-class hunter team was doing here, but the military man said that the D-class hunter or the hunter team was not responsible for the victory. The man frowned and asked what happened then. The military man pointed at the protagonist and said that they were still investigating, but as far as they knew, that F-class hunter had killed the monster along with his clones. The man frowned and wondered if an F-class hunter with clones could defeat a D-class monster. He inspected the monster's body and realized that all the attacks were single-wound, probably a strategy to deal damage without a special weapon. The protagonist was chatting pleasantly with Junmo, and the man was watching from the side, wondering if it was possible to shoot a moving monster and accurately in the wound. He turned around, frowning. He then walked past the soldier and said that they could finish the investigation, since they would check if there were any other D-class monsters behind the portal. The monster's corpse was still lying on the floor. The man walked up to the portal, wondering if he should tell the association that he was the one who dealt with the monster. The protagonist was wiping the blood from his face when he suddenly saw many system windows, which notified him that he had improved his skills. The clones were lying on a bench, and the protagonist looked at them, wondering if they had survived because of regeneration. Junmo turned to Sun and asked about the clones, and the boy replied that they were injured, but his skill needed time to summon them again, so he thought that if he let them recover on their own, he would increase their regeneration stat. Sanwoo put his hand on his neck and said that he felt a little ashamed to say that after asking for trust, but it was dangerous. Junmo spread his arms and said that he thought the protagonist could hunt E-class monsters without a problem. The boy raised his finger and shouted something about a short sword. He walked past the crowd and said that the monster had a unique short sword that absorbed blood. He reached for the sword that was on the floor and said that complete madness began when the monster's eyes turned red. Sanwoo thought he was going to die. Junmo grabbed it and said that he thought the boy should ask the clone to pick it up since it might be a cursed item. Sanwoo frowned and asked if that meant he couldn't use it. Junmo smiled happily and said that cursed items were quite rare, so they could be very expensive depending on the effects. He looked away and said that he would let the clone have it for now and said that he thought that it was time to call it a day since he couldn't stay long until the reporters arrived. He put his hand in his pocket and asked the agent if the item that fell out of the monster's head was expensive. He held out his hand, holding an item. Jumno's mouth opened in surprise. He was holding a red gem in his hand. Jumno's mouth opened in surprise since it was a low-level gem that was an invaluable item. The protagonist blushed as he looked at it, and Jumno mentally said that it was very hard to tell the protagonist the truth. He widened his eyes and said that it was a cheap item since it couldn't be used on a human, and there were some serious side effects, so it was very cheap. The protagonist immediately threw it to the ground. Junmo held out his hand and said that the other items would be quite expensive, so the protagonist shouldn't be upset. Sanwoo lowered his head and asked him to take care of the items he had collected. The door to the apartment opened. The three of them walked inside. The protagonist extended his hand and said that he would summon number 3 again first. Everything around him began to glow. His third clone appeared in front of him. Sanwoo gave him his equipment and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The protagonist took off his bloody clothes. Then he crouched down on the floor. There was a sword in the box. The stone was next to the sword, so the protagonist said that it was time to take care of the items he had received. He picked up the phone and said that it was a power-up stone. He had read on some website that the stone could not be used on a human, but it could work on a summoned creature, but it would turn it into a monster. Sanwoo put his hand to his chin and mentally said that a permanent increase in strength by 5,000 sounded tempting, but he was worried about the side effects. The protagonist imagined a hungry and wounded clone and thought about how, under normal circumstances, the clone's wounds and other suffering would not be transmitted to him. He widened his eyes and wondered what if turning into a monster would have an effect on him. He imagined himself as a snake. Junmo immediately started shooting at the protagonist and screaming for him to die. The protagonist closed his eyes and put the stone aside, deciding that he would not use it for now. He then turned his attention to the sword. He remembered how Agent Junmo grabbed him from behind and told him that he should ask the clone to pick up the sword since it might be a cursed item. The sword was in a box, and the protagonist began to say that they put it in the box just in case, so there would be no problem during transportation. And besides, it would not be such a bad thing to sell it since it was an expensive item, but why not use it before selling it? He looked at the second clone and ordered him to pick up the sword. The clone reached out with his hand. He picked up the sword and raised it above himself, and Sanwoo screamed. However, nothing happened. The clone simply held the sword in his hands. The protagonist waved his hands and asked if that was all, and the clone reported hearing a voice. Sanwoo activated the familiar skill. An aura appeared around him. He frowned when he heard the sword begging for blood. He grabbed his ears and deactivated the skill, exclaiming that it was too loud. The protagonist looked at his clone and thought about how it didn't seem to affect him, except for the fact that the voice was very noisy. The clone lowered the sword, and Sanwoo suggested that he use the sword for a while. He then saw a system window that notified him that he had improved the regeneration skill. The protagonist looked at the clones and thought that resting must be helping them regenerate faster. He closed his eyes and said that from tomorrow on, he would need to send them out to hunt, and they were still like this. He put his hand on the bed and said that today they would all meditate to unlock the mana breath. Sanwoo closed his eyes and an aura appeared around him. Meanwhile, the sun was shining on the city. Many people were walking along the streets of the city. Everyone was walking in different directions. Sanwoo entered the school and thought about how the vacation flew by so quickly. He opened his eyes and wondered if it was because he was busy leveling up his stats. Besides, his stats had increased significantly since he didn't give the clones a second to rest. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. He cried and said that he didn't know that he was so lonely, and besides, no one even tried to pretend to know him. The protagonist peeked out from around the corner. Jayondo was sitting at the desk in front of the protagonist. He smiled and said that he didn't know that he and Sanwoo were in the same class. He looked at him with a smile and said that he signed up for this class because he heard that the teacher was generous with grades. The green-haired girl watched them from the side. She and her friend looked at each other and wondered if this was the same Sanwoo who was fat. The girls started to gape in shock and wonder if they should ask him out on a blind date. Jundo smiled and said that Sanwoo was popular, and the protagonist replied that he now understood why no one greeted him. He pointed at himself and asked if he had changed that much. Jundo frowned and said that he swore that even his parents wouldn't recognize him. Sanwoo grabbed his head and said that he was planning on going home for a while, and Jundo added that when he saw him on the street, he barely recognized him. Then he smiled and offered him a drink after class, but the protagonist replied that he already had plans. He opened his mouth wide and wondered what Sanwoo had said. The protagonist began to sweat heavily and said that he had already promised, so he could not go with Jaeondo. The man began to spit from his mouth and call Sanwoo a traitor who would go drinking with a girl, but Sanwoo began to try to convince him otherwise. He then pointed to the other two men in the classroom and said that they had already heard everything. The sun's rays illuminated the windows of the school, and Jaeondo shouted that he would remember this day. The building of the International Hunters Association now appeared. There were many people in the classroom. One of the workers looked menacingly at the screen. The assistant, looking at his boss, said that the oracle predicted a catastrophe. Michael, raising the corners of his lips, asked what the essence of it was. The guy, holding a folder in his hand, answered that the creation of a portal and the invasion of hundreds of monsters. The chairman lowered his head and asked if the location of the portal and the date of the invasion were known, to which he was told that the highest rank would be a class, and there was also a high probability that the portal would open within a few days. After looking at the documents, the assistant explained that the probable location was South Korea. South Korea appeared from above. After a while, a man could be seen shuffling his feet. Wani adjusted his tie and wondered what was going on and why there were so many people here. Suddenly, Miho's ears appeared and she loudly called out for Mr. The girl abruptly pushed Guildmaster Kindness off his seat. Mr., falling to the floor, said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Guildmaster Yolo, clasping her hands, said that something big must be happening since even he was here. Wanti, sweat on his face, exclaimed that he could say the same thing. Miss, walking down the hallway, asked if he had grown a mustache to flirt with her, to which he replied that he had simply been busy lately. A moment later, the boys entered the interview room. Heesung looked to the side thoughtfully. The man adjusted his tie and asked if it was Wanti. Miho sighed heavily and called him a boastful man. The gentleman, standing by the window, asked what had happened, to which he was asked why he was so cold, because they could at least greet him. Guildmaster Kindness, closing his eyes, objected that if he had finished, he would take his place. Frowning menacingly, the boss added that there was only one tower. Heesung, smiling broadly, said that he had heard that the first team of the Kindness Guild had recently gone there. The interview participants, through sweat on their faces, listened that there had been no news from them in the past few days, and the man became curious about how everything was going. Ilgon extended his finger and exclaimed that it was enough. The guild leader, with his hands in his pocket, asked, didn't they say that the results weren't good enough, and apologetically added that his memory was no longer what it used to be. The master's body was surrounded by bright flames. A drop of sweat ran down Miho's cheek. Wani spread his fingers fiercely. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A moment later, the association leader arrived. Grandfather raised his eyebrows and asked if something was wrong. The man narrowed his eyes angrily. A second later, he sighed heavily. The conference participants lowered their heads. Byung-hun looked ahead in bewilderment. Sitting down on a chair, the association leader said that he was pleased to see all the guild leaders and first wanted to thank everyone for their response. Narrowing his eyes, Grandfather explained that their country had recently received a disaster warning from the International Hunters Association. Heesung smirked and wondered if it was the Oracle. The association leader opened his mouth and said that they had received information that a portal would open and monsters would pour out. And since there was a suspicion that a rank monsters would be present, they were asking for the cooperation of the country's top guilds. The boy raised his palm and asked where and when it would happen, to which they replied that they had no specific details other than that the portal would open in their country. Ilgon opened his mouth wide and shouted if they were asking them to cover the entire country and wait until the portal appeared. Byung-hun hid behind a folder and said that that was why they were here to hold a meeting on the matter, and all they knew was that it would happen soon. The young man raised his hand and exclaimed that they didn't even have enough hunters to complete their tasks, and wondered how they could be expected to stop a disaster without proper information about when and where it would happen, and whether they would pay the hunters who would be sent to deal with the disaster. The grandfather scratched his forehead and thought about it. Wani extended his fingers and asked if he wanted to hear his proposal. The association leader opened his jaw and gave him permission to speak. Holding a piece of paper in his hand, the man explained that each guild should prepare a group of hunters who could be sent out immediately in case of an emergency to monitor the surrounding areas, and that during a disaster, all guilds should concentrate their main forces in the right place. The gentleman lowered his eyebrows and added that those guilds that refused to cooperate would be severely punished. Heesung crossed his fingers and looked to the side. Byung-hun, with sweat on his face, said that it was a reasonable suggestion and asked if anyone else wanted to speak, and explained that if there were no more suggestions, they would vote and have everyone raise their hands if they were in favor of the suggestion. After a moment, the guild leaders raised their hands and muttered that they were already in charge of patrolling their region. Miho shyly extended her hand. Hee-sung smiled contentedly. The association leader sighed heavily, believing that they had come to an agreement. Taking out the documents, the grandfather exclaimed that in that case, they would follow the suggestion of the guild leader Kindness and asked them to protect their area and maintain close ties with each other. After a while, a wide street appeared. Sanwoo, holding his backpack, muttered that time flies quickly on the first day. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed the young guys. The stranger, smiling widely, said that she was his type and would leave as soon as he shared his number. Haeyoung, fixing her hair, replied that she said she had a boyfriend, to which the guy offered to be friends. The protagonist, with his hands in his pockets, asked what she was doing there. The girl, clenching her fist, called him baby and asked if he had arrived. The hunter, lowering his eyebrows, asked her again. The daughter Dokshil, taking the young man by the hand, exclaimed that she had been waiting for him for too long and added that they needed to go. After some time, the evening city was visible. Sangwoo, looking to the side, asked if the stranger had forced her to give him her number, and that was why they had left so quickly. And Haeyoung explained that she had told him that she had a boyfriend and the protagonist had approached him at that very moment. The girl, opening her mouth wide, screamed that in any case, she did not have a boyfriend. The protagonist, walking down the street, asked why she asked him to buy her meat today since she had classes, to which Dokchil's daughter said that their school had an anniversary today, and the guy asked if that was why she wasn't in her school uniform and thought that something had happened. Contentedly closing her eyes, Haeyoung asked if he could look away from her when she was in casual clothes and if he wanted to take her number, and the hunter exclaimed that he already had it. Suddenly, the young man reached into his pocket. Taking out his phone, Sangwoo read a message from Junmo that the payment minus all expenses had been transferred to the account. Clenching his fist, the protagonist wondered if he had already earned 50 million, and added that his clones were the best. Raising his finger, the protagonist shouted that he could choose any meat, even the most expensive, and Haeyoung exclaimed that she eats a lot and asked if he was sure he could afford it. In the evening, tall buildings were visible and the answer was heard that they would eat veal, and the girl objected that it was very expensive, and the guy asked her not to think about money. A sign for Korean veal appeared. Food was being fried in a frying pan. The boys were happily snacking. Daughter Dokshil, with her jaw open, told the teacher that it was delicious, to which he said that she was right. Haeyoung, with her eyes bulging, said that it was really expensive and asked if he was sure he could afford it. The young man lowered his eyebrows and reminded her that he had asked her not to think about money and just eat. A moment later, the girl raised her hand. Sanwoo turned around and ordered more beef for 4. People in the restaurant suddenly took out their phones. You could see how the guy was looking at the screen in bewilderment. A man appeared on the TV, whose image suddenly froze. A message about a disaster appeared on the screen. A sign warning of a monster invasion through a portal was visible, and it was said that a state of emergency had been declared across the country at the moment. The boy's eyes widened in surprise and heard that all residents were advised to check the location of evacuation sites and prepare supplies in case of a disaster. Jendo was crying and screaming, saying that it was unfair that Sana was walking with a girl while they were walking the streets alone. The man with glasses glanced at Jendo and said that they weren't even sure that Sana was dating a girl. A moment later, he saw the protagonist and Hien in a restaurant. They were smiling at each other while talking about something. The man suddenly clenched his teeth and angrily said that he would kill Sana. The phone in Jendo's pocket vibrated. When the boy picked up the phone, his friend, who was holding the man with glasses, asked him what happened there. Jendo frowned, saying that something bad was happening. In the chat rooms on the forums, people were asking each other what was going on and saying that they wouldn't even go to the shelters. Barely holding his friend in glasses, the boy asked Jendo if it was too quiet for a disaster to happen, shouldn't the siren have gone off? The protagonist walked out of the restaurant. When Hien came out, Sangwoo wondered what his friends were doing there. The two boys smiled, covering Chanwoo's angry mouth, and said that they saw them eating together when they passed by. Was she his girlfriend? Hien blushed in embarrassment, and the protagonist answered sadly, saying that she was his student, and he was just treating her for helping him last time. The girl bowed and introduced herself, as Sangwoo introduced his friends from the university. Sangwoo picked up his bag. He handed it to the girl, saying that since they didn't have time to eat, he asked them to pack the leftovers with them so she could eat with her father and mother. Hee-young was happy and thanked the guy. Chan-woo and Jeong-sung froze in shock when Sang-woo told Hee-young not to go anywhere and go straight home. Since her parents were probably worried, the guys realized that their friend was acting like a teacher. Slightly blushing from embarrassment, Hee-young asked if they were going somewhere or that was it for today. The guy raised an eyebrow in confusion, saying that her parents would not be happy if they were going out somewhere after the alarm was sounded. His friends immediately called the guy a grump and an old man with disdain, which angered Sang-woo. The protagonist angrily pointed at them, ordering everyone to quickly go home. Sang-woo froze and looked away, hearing laughter. A couple of people were leaving the bar having fun with their friends. The protagonist frowned slightly, wondering if he was the only one reacting so sharply because of anxiety. All the passers-by were chatting cheerfully, acting as usual. The guy picked up the phone. Soon Junmo picked up the phone and then Sang-woo asked him if he heard the announcement about the disaster. The man replied saying that he was just about to call about it. Bowing his head, the man said that according to unofficial information, the association wants to remain in this position for another 3 months, and this is due to the fact that the location of the portal is unknown, but the number of monsters is terrifying. Beads of sweat flowed down San's face when his acquaintance said that class of monsters are expected to appear, so if the portal opens in the capital, deaths are inevitable. Raising his hand, the protagonist asked if in this case it would be better to give people more information, telling them to be careful. Sitting on the sofa, Junmo said that the problem is the 3-month gap. If they notify people, it will cause irreparable harm to the economy and the most important industries of the country. The protagonist gritted his teeth and said that this way the association can say that they warn people if something serious happens. Putting on his suit, Junmo said that right now he is heading to the shelter and the hunting grounds should already be closed, so hunting is impossible. The events take us to San's house. Entering the room, he asked his clones how they were feeling. The second clone, sitting next to the first, said that everything was fine. Sanu became sad and looked away. He saw that number 2 was unharmed, but number 1 had serious wounds. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of the guy with a description of the cloning skill. Number 1 looked sharply at the original when he said that he would be summoned again. A moment later, a bright light illuminated the room. The summoned clone put on his uniform. Sanu handed him a cap, saying that he had better put on a cap so as not to get confused. Soon number 3 entered the room. Sanu turned to him, thought about it and suggested that they go home. At night, the protagonist came to his parents' house. He went up the elevator thinking about how long he had been gone. He reached out to the intercom. When the door opened, the guy held out a bag of goodies, telling his mother that he was back. The protagonist's mother opened her mouth and froze. Sanu narrowed his eyes and smiled, realizing that his mother really didn't recognize him. Raising her hand, the woman asked the boy if he was Sanu. The protagonist scratched the back of his head and said that it was indeed him. His mother immediately became worried, asking him if he was hungry. The father left the room, asking if it was really Sanu. Suddenly, a joyful Jew appeared. She put her hands on her hips, saying that as soon as he returned, he should have looked for his cute little sister. A moment later, her eyes widened in shock. The protagonist smiled nervously, looking at Ju. The girl froze, not recognizing her brother. The boy shed tears, remembering Jendo and his words. When he took off his shoes, his mother asked if he came with friends and why they were all wearing masks. Sanu answered by saying that they were not his friends. Turning to the clones, he told them to take off their masks. The whole family screamed in horror and fear, opening their mouths. All 3 clones took off their masks, revealing their faces. A moment later, the protagonist's mother's scream was heard from the house. Sitting at the table, Sang-woo calmed everyone down by saying that he had taken part in the Awakening program a month ago and that his clones were his ability. Holding a cup of tea in her hand, the woman said that she had heard that many young people were taking part in it, but she did not expect him to go too. The father, sitting opposite, asked his son if he had become a hunter now, and he scratched his head and said that he was not going to hide it. The protagonist's mother frowned, saying that being a hunter was dangerous. Jiu watched a video on her phone while her brother tried to convince his mother that his job was safe. Raising his hand, the guy said that an impending disaster had recently been announced, so they should go to a shelter. Stroking his chin, the father told his son that they had already packed their things just in case, but for now they needed to observe the situation. Raising his hand, he said that he still had to go to work tomorrow, so they couldn't just leave the house. Sang-woo frowned, realizing that they didn't know how serious it was, like the rest of them, so the townspeople were calm. He gritted his teeth in anger. Sighing, the guy opened his eyes and said that in that case, he would stay with them from now on. He also received a message that school was cancelled. Putting a bag of food on the table, the protagonist said that he was at the restaurant, but due to the alarm, he had to leave. Standing up, his mother told the protagonist that she would cook everything now since he was probably hungry. Watching his mother leave, the guy mentally said that he should have visited his family more often. The clones looked at their mother in admiration when she asked them if they would eat. But a moment later, they sadly bowed their heads when Sang-woo said that the clones could eat, but meat was too good a dish for them. Soon, various dishes were placed on the table. Soups and salads filled the table. 3 clones sat nearby with a large bowl of rice. The family sat down at the table, getting ready to eat. Jiu covered her mouth and asked her brother if he would get better if all the clones and he ate. Sang-woo replied saying that he would not get better. His mother smiled, saying that it had been a long time since they had a family gathering. The protagonist looked at his family peacefully. Suddenly, the walls next to him exploded. Sanwoo slowly opened his eyes through the darkness. Soon he saw the destruction caused by the explosion. The boy was lying on the floor, injured. He stood up trying to understand what had happened. His eyes widened in shock and he froze. The entire upper part of the building had been released. A huge monster was raging nearby, and wyverns and other monsters were flying in the sky. The huge monster opened its mouth. Godzilla began to gather flames in his mouth. A moment later, he shot a beam of flames. The stream of flame destroyed everything in its path. The protagonist, terrified, opened his mouth in amazement. He immediately looked at his unconscious relatives. Ju and his mother were lying on the floor. Taking number 1's uniform in his hands, he realized what had happened. The guy heard a crack and turned his head. Number 2 and number 3 came out from under the rubble. Approaching them, Sanwoo asked number 3 if he was okay after losing his arm. He replied saying that the bleeding had stopped. The guy grabbed his head, number 1 had disappeared, and number 3 was seriously injured. He did not expect the portal to open so soon. Suddenly, his mother stood up. Seeing that all the family members began to get up, the protagonist told them that they should get out of here as soon as possible. The guy's father looked back and felt anger and horror seeing his house in such a state. Taking a gun in his hands, Sanwoo said that the house was not important now. Looking at the monsters raging outside, he said that the portal had already opened. The city was almost destroyed. The monsters grabbed all the people they came across. Some were kneeling in front of the corpse of their relatives. One of the monsters dragged a man from the roof with him. Many ground monsters were running through the streets. Soon the protagonist gathered all his things. His father put on his bag and grabbed a bat, while his son asked his sister if she put everything on correctly. The girl examined herself and said that the protection was a little big. Looking at the clone who lost his arm, she asked if he was okay. Sanu answered saying that everything was fine with him. A huge body fell from the sky. A moment later, it fell right in front of the protagonist. The orc trembled after falling from a great height. He received terrible injuries. Sanu frowned seeing the monster fall from the sky. Seeing another monster fall from the sky, the guy assumed that a portal opened in the sky and the monsters fell because they could not fly. The protagonist swung his dagger killing the orc. The system notified him of a 1,000% increase in mana. Ju's hands trembled as he tried to open the door. The father and daughter tried to force the door open, but they couldn't. The protagonist grabbed his father's bat, telling him to step back. Sanwoo took the bat and used his kick skill. His eye glowed brightly. A moment later, he struck the door handle. The handle broke and flew off. The protagonist kicked the door open. The entire family froze in shock upon seeing this. Soon, they reached the 12th house. Looking back, Sanwoo said that this simply couldn't be happening. The cars in front of him were destroyed by the monsters that fell on them. Looking at his father, the boy asked how far it was to the nearest shelter, and his father replied that they needed to walk 2 kilometers. Somewhere off to the side, the liquid was gathering into something. The bones were reunited again, forming skeletons. The stones and boulders formed the bodies of golems. The protagonist gritted his teeth when he saw this. He realized that there were monsters here, as they were not affected by the fall in height. Ju screamed and scared her brother, saying that they could use the underground tunnels. Because there was a temporary shelter there, the whole family immediately turned around and ran in the other direction. Sanu froze when he heard the man's plea. Turning around, he saw a man crushed by rubble. The guy was trying to get out, asking for help. The monster suddenly opened his eyes. He grabbed the edge of the rubble. The guy started crying and stared at the monster in horror. The troll, who was a D-class monster, began to stand up. The protagonist's father frowned. He turned to his son, telling him that he should think rationally, because they were in no position to help anyone. While a drop of sweat was running down his face, he told Sin that it was time for them to go down. The protagonist closed his eyes, realizing that number 3 couldn't fight properly, and with number 2, saving the boy would be almost impossible. The boy was crying and screaming, begging for help. San turned around, realizing that he himself was not a clone that could be used with the skill. His eyes involuntarily widened in fear. He knew that he would die if he stayed. Suddenly, his heart began to beat faster. The mother came down and told her son that it was time for them to go. The boy clenched his fists, calling for his mother. San closed his eyes and told his family to close the doors as soon as they came down. Jiu and her mother frowned and looked up when they heard his words. Number 3 nodded when San told him to protect his family with all his might. Jiu objected, saying that he needed to go down. The father frowned at his son, asking if he was leaving. The protagonist nervously smiled and said that he was a hunter after all. A moment later, he and number 2 rushed forward. Number 3 grabbed Jiu, not letting her escape. In a situation like this, when monsters fell from the sky and attacked people like the troll, only hunters gave people hope. The protagonist threw the monster back with a blow. The troll stood up and roared. Sanu put the bat on his shoulder and told the clone to take the guy to safety. Pointing at the monster with his hand, Sanu told him to go to him. The man and the monster froze for a moment, looking at each other. The eyes of a certain monster flashed in the darkness. He was watching everything from the roof of another building. Number 2 grabbed the debris. He lifted a huge piece of the wall. Having freed himself, the guy thanked the protagonist. The troll grinned widely, looking at the prey. The clone and the original looked at the clone and said that he was clearly a huge creature. Number 2 took out his weapon. Sanu took out a crystal, saying that they would use everything they had. Looking at the crystal in his hand, he said that now was not the time to be picky. He threw the crystal to the clone, saying to eat it. Number 2 immediately took a bite. His body trembled. The clone's skin changed color and his pupil stretched. The protagonist watched the changes in surprise. Soon a heavily altered clone stood in front of him with a sword in his hand. The protagonist looked at the frowning clone and asked if he was still on his side. He answered affirmatively and briefly. The troll pointed at the clone with a puzzled finger, saying that he was on their side. The protagonist looked at his hand when the system reported increased strength. The two guys looked at the huge enemy in front of them. The troll raised his club. He dragged it along the ground. A moment later, he launched pieces of earth at the guys. One of the stones grazed the guy's cheek. He began to knock off all the fragments at great speed. The troll extended his hand to Sin. Number 2 cut the monster's hand with his sword. Blood splashed on Number 2. The protagonist looked at him and said that this sword in the clone's hand was amazing. The monster roared in pain while his blood spurted from the wound. He swung his club and began to beat with it. Dodging the blows, the protagonist was glad that the monster was slower than the fishman. In a second, the guy was near the monster's head. He immediately hit him on the head. The troll managed to block his blow with his hand. San opened his eyes wide, amazed that the troll's hand was restored. With one blow, the monster threw the guy back. The protagonist rolled on the ground. Starting to get up, he gritted his teeth, realizing that the troll had strong regeneration. The skin itself was not hard and was easily cut by Number 2, who stood opposite the monster. However, all the wounds on the body healed in seconds. He was recovering too quickly. Sanu gritted his teeth and frowned. It was almost impossible to damage such an enemy. When Number 2 dodged the blow, the protagonist ordered him to knock the monster down. Number 2 intercepted the weapon with both hands. He cut the troll's leg in a second. The monster fell to one knee because of the wound. He opened his mouth and roared when his eye was hit by bullets. The protagonist, holding a gun in his hands, said that despite the regeneration, this would definitely blind the enemy for a while. At that moment, Number 2 cut the troll's other leg at great speed. Blood burst out of the wound. The monster's body began to fall. His recovering eyes began to tear up. A moment later, he stopped crying, opening his eyes wide. The protagonist appeared in front of him, activating the strike skill. The guy smiled, saying that this was a great place. The bat distorted the monster's face. Sanu roared, and his eyes sparkled with tension. With a blow, he was able to throw the body of the monster back. The guy's face twisted from the pain in his hand. He involuntarily looked at his hand, realizing that this was a side effect of the skill. Looking at the troll's body, the protagonist mentally said that his strength was comparable to the fishman. Starting to get up, he told Number 2 that they had to go. Shaking his clothes, the guy tried to find a phone. Not finding it, he asked Number 2 to give him his. The clone, who had changed his appearance, held out the phone. Taking the phone, Sanu laughed, telling the clone that if he went to the shelter like this, he would definitely be thrown out. Suddenly, the guy turned his head and froze. In the distance, he saw a crowd of running people asking for help. The guy massaged the bridge of his nose and thought, "Events take us to another part of the city." Planes flew over the city. The shadow of the planes covered the roads. Godzilla stepped on the car. The monster scanned the area, looking for prey. It concentrated the flames in its mouth again. It turned its head sharply when the flames hit it. A man with an outstretched hand looked at the monster. The members of the 9th Rank Guild, Red Fire, gathered together to confront the monster. A man with a mustache and beard gritted his teeth in anger. The leader of the 7th Rank Guild, Scorpion, shouted, saying that they cannot lose to other guilds, and if they do not break through by at least one monster, they will not receive their salary. Godzilla opened its mouth. It roared as the teams of the two guilds attacked it. Massive explosions began to occur throughout the city. The plane continued to fly through the city. The pilot turned his head, saying that they had arrived at their destination. The plane's hatch opened. Wanty and his group members approached the hatch. The man frowned at the city. A group of monsters appeared in front of the plane. A machine gun emerged from the top of the plane. A moment later, bullets were flying at the monster. The soldier looked at Vanti and shouted, saying that the megalosaurs were moving away. The man turned to him, saying that since several guilds were targeting them, joining them would cost manpower. So the plane calmly flew over the monsters. The hunter who killed the monster did not even bother to sleep the guy crushed by it. Another hunter tore the bracelet off the girl's corpse. Vanti angrily looked at them and called them bastards. The pilot sitting in the cockpit reported that several survivors were spotted 700 meters to the north. Blunty immediately poured mana into his eye. In the distance, he saw a group of people. He saw that 2 guys were protecting the group from the monsters. The man froze in surprise, mentally saying that the guys held up well, but the number of monsters was too great for 2 to handle. Putting on a mask, he said that he was heading north. Looking at the group members behind him, he ordered them to unite and begin the rescue. A moment later, he jumped out. Mechanical wings opened on his back. Thanks to the wings, he was able to fly forward. The protagonist was breathing heavily while holding the bat in his hands. He planned to return as soon as he finished off the troll, but everything went wrong. The goblin standing in front of him smirked. The people behind the guy looked at the monsters in fear. Sanu turned around and ordered the people to run to the shelter. They screamed, saying that there were monsters behind them too. Attacking the goblin, the protagonist ordered number 2 to take care of the rear. The goblin jumped at the man with a grin on his face. Number 2 arrived in time and pierced the monster. Sanu grabbed the gun and shot the goblins in the heads. The guy bowed his head, feeling tired. He could no longer use the strike skill due to the energy consumption. Suddenly, the space in front of him brightly lit up. A moment later, a huge bird burst out of the rubble. Dodging the attack, the protagonist said that this creature had risen again. A fiery liquid began to gather near the monster's beak. A moment later, it flew in all directions. The protagonist put his hands in front of his face, trying to block the attack. Drops of fiery liquid rushed towards the people. Number 2 stood in front of the woman with the child. He spread his arms to the sides, blocking all the projectiles. Blood burst out of the clone's mouth. Sanu lowered the bat to the ground. The guy cursed, seeing the state of the clone. The guy's hand was burned. Suddenly, a paw appeared over the bird like a monster. Another monster pressed the bird to the ground with its paw. The tiger emerged from the shadows and opened its mouth. Sanu froze, seeing the tiger. The goblin standing to the side also froze in horror, looking at the tiger. Number 2's body dissolved. Sanu looked back and looked at the people. He fell on his butt to the ground. The guy did not resist the approaching paw. Suddenly, in complete darkness, something turned. The protagonist closed his eyes, expecting to die. Feeling no pain, he slowly opened his eye. Wanty was standing right in front of him, holding a sword in his hand. A cut appeared on the monster's neck, and blood began to gush out. The people standing nearby opened their mouths in surprise. Wanty turned to the people and asked if everything was okay. The protagonist, with wide eyes, tried to say something. When the tiger's head fell to the ground, Wanty introduced himself. The events take us to the shelter. A camera was set up above the door of the shelter. The people inside calmed down a little, bandaging their wounds. The guys looked sadly at the man cursing on the side. Ju demanded that number 2 let her go so that she could save her brother. He replied, saying that he could not allow it. The girl's hand trembled from the effort. Ju, barely holding back her tears, screamed, asking the clone if he, being a clone, should not save the original. He replied, saying that his priority was the original's team. The father frowned at his daughter, telling her to stop. The girl looked at her father, asking him if he was not worried at all after seeing with his own eyes what was happening outside. The father answered, saying that it was much more dangerous to go out. Besides, the creature in front of her was Sanu's skill. Since the clone was alive, then he was too. The girl also frowned and tried to object. The man turned to his daughter, saying that he was convinced that his son really worked as a hunter and they needed to trust him. If they went out, they would only interfere by forcing him to defend themselves. Jiu looked at her father in shock. She lowered the hand that the clone was holding. Suddenly, both of them flinched when they heard a knock. Someone was knocking on the door, asking for help. Smiling, Jiu assumed that her brother had come. Her father immediately objected, saying that the voice was different. The man sitting to the side frowned and said that the person did not know the password. Perhaps he was from another house. The camera showed a human body. Jiu ran forward, saying that she would go and open the door. Her father wanted to stop her, saying that it was too dark on the camera. The girl smiled as she approached the door. She saw that there was someone behind the man, and she was sure that it was her brother. Soon the doors began to open. The girl looked out, calling for her brother. In his place, she saw only a corpse. The corpse's legs were sliding along the floor. Huge claws were holding the corpse by the neck, and their owner, imitating a human voice, was calling for help. Jiu froze and with wide eyes. The monster pushed the corpse away from itself. He threw it into the wall. Then he grabbed the door and left. The B-class monster opened its mouth, looking at the prey. The man sitting behind froze in horror. Everyone suddenly stood up and ran away. Only clone number 3 rushed towards the monster. He pointed his blade at the monster's eyes. Suddenly the clone froze. A huge claw pierced his body. The guy started coughing up blood. The limb of the monster pierced his body. The limb also pierced Jiu's stomach. Jiu's father and mother immediately screamed upon seeing this and rushed towards her. The girl involuntarily turned to her parents. A moment later, she fell. Number 3 frowned and grabbed the gun. He shot the emergency switch. The device broke and reported the detection of critical damage. The doors immediately began to close due to the activation of the emergency isolation. The clone's legs swelled from the strain. With a jerk, he and the monster jumped forward, so the guy was able to hold back the monster while the doors were closing. Soon the doors closed completely. Wani stood next to the protagonist and asked for forgiveness for being late. Sanwoo, looking at the outstretched hand, remembered that this man was conducting the awakening program. Grabbing the man's hand, he introduced himself and thanked him for saving him. Wani smiled, saying that he hadn't done anything special because the video showed that he had saved all these people. Although he had almost died, he hadn't escaped until the very end. The protagonist awkwardly scratched his head, saying that he couldn't do that when there were so many people here. Looking at the happy people, Wani said that conscience easily switches off in dangerous situations. The guy blushed with embarrassment. Wani, watching the guy, was surprised by his strange laughter. 5 minutes ago, he was flying in the air. He frowned, looking at the battlefield. He saw how one of the guys covered people with his body. The man frowned even more and began to curse mentally. Suddenly, the guy's body dissolved, leaving behind only clothes. Soon, the tiger appeared. Wani grabbed the sword, intending to save the guy. It was like a stream of light fell on the ground. Looking at the protagonist, the man thought about who that guy turned into Mana was. When Sanwoo raised the bat, he asked him if he was a hunter. The protagonist answered, saying that he had registered recently. Smiling, the man asked what his skill was. Suddenly, the guy's body shuddered in horror. Sweat began to flow down his face. He decided not to hide his ability since the man saved his life. When he was about to say something to Wanti, a stream of mana passed through his head. The guy felt a terrifying pressure. He lost contact with number 2. He immediately grabbed his sword. Sanwoo rushed away, asking for forgiveness from Wanti and saying that his family was in danger. The man looked after the guy and shouted, saying that it was dangerous to go alone. Raising his mask, he told his subordinates through the radio to immediately track his location and take the survivors to a safe place. Then he looked at the sky. The protagonist, gritting his teeth, ran with all his might. His sword began to exude terrifying mana. Sangwoo's eyes turned red and blood poured out of them. The system reported the activation of the sprint skill. The sword in the guy's hand screamed, telling the guy to die. Explosions were happening all over the city. The man with the mustache extended his hand, concentrating the flames. The system notified him of the activation of the fireball skill. The flames hit the huge monster. His comrade turned to him and said that they needed more firepower, so it was better to concentrate on one point. Suddenly, the monster's foot landed on him. The man frowned and shouted, telling the support team to disperse. The man with the huge blade swung it. The veins on his head bulged from the strain. The monster's skin was too thick, its poison could not penetrate inside. He jumped back. Then his temporary comrade said that the situation had gotten worse now, and now was not the time to compete, they needed to cooperate. Suddenly, both hunters turned around when someone laughed at this idea. Heesung stood with his hands in his pockets and said that he came because he heard that a lot of money was waiting for him here. Heesung grinned and extended his hand. The monster raised its head as its body was illuminated by light. The two hunters looked at the sky in shock. Heesung looked at the falling meteorites and said that absolute strength does not necessarily need to work with someone. The events take us to the shelter. The father was crying, telling Ju not to fall asleep. The girl raised her trembling hand, saying that it hurt. The woman cried and picked up a bandage, asking her daughter to hold on for a bit. Suddenly, something hit the door hard. The father immediately looked at the door. He saw a cut in the middle of the door. A moment later, the doors began to bend. The monster made a hole and crawled through it. The people felt horror and trembled. Ju was crying, telling her parents to run. The firefly opened its mouth, telling everyone to die. The parents sat next to their daughter and did not think of running away. The mother closed her eyes while crying. The protagonist suddenly appeared behind the monster. His eyes were shining brightly as he looked at the enemy. The firefly froze and looked at the guy. The protagonist's father turned around and saw his son. He was angry. His sword exuded a terrifying aura. The boys crying inside the shelter begged for help. The protagonist's eye turned very red. The monster did not move, waiting for the enemy to act. Sanwoo's father cried, looking at his son. The protagonist himself looked at his unconscious sister. His body froze and straightened, and his eyes returned to normal for a moment. The guy frowned. His body began to tremble with anger. Once again falling into a berserker state, he rushed forward. His body disappeared from the spot in an instant. The monster raised his limb. The guy ended up behind the monster with a wound on his shoulder. He himself struck the monster. Blood spurted abundantly from his wound. The monster stuck out its tongue and called out to Ju. The blade of the sword was covered in blood. A bright fire appeared around it. The protagonist clenched his teeth furiously. Sanwoo swung the blade. The monster moved to another room. It swung its paw. Sharp claws appeared right in front of the boy's face. Vonti's subordinate saved him, leaning on him with her whole body. The man frowned menacingly. Firefly raised a trembling paw. The girl smiled widely and said that she had caught her comrade. Guild member Kindness jumped into the air. He managed to kick the enemy and throw him back. The woman frowned and noticed that her friend had serious injuries. The young man raised his head and screamed. The huntress assumed that this was a berserker state. A magic circle appeared in her hand. The system reported that the mana transfer skill was activated. A bright light illuminated the faces of the heroes. The student opened his mouth wide and began to breathe heavily. The sword fell from his hand. The awakened one asked if he was okay. His subordinate put her hand on her comrade's chest and said that he was in a bad way, so they needed to kill that monster quickly. Blood gushed out of the protagonist's mouth. The girl started giving him a heart massage and asked him to be quiet since he had an open wound. Wanti's eyes widened when he heard that his comrade's sister was injured. Sanwoo grabbed his ally's hand. The boy began to cry and asked her to quickly save his sister. The man asked him not to worry. His hand was engulfed in blue fire. The monster looked up and opened its mouth. Suddenly, the monster spread its paws and screamed. Guild member Kindness's eyes flashed with fire and said that neither his friend nor his sister would die today. The young man closed his eyes. The awakened one walked towards the monster and promised that everything would be over soon. Byung-hoon was sitting at the desk in his office. A voice said that an emergency evacuation was needed because the situation was getting out of control. The old man spread out documents on the desk. The heroes walked down the hallway. The guild member said that they would prepare everything as soon as they were ready. The man looked away when someone called out to him. Heesung smirked and said that he wanted to consult with him. The bodyguard asked him to watch his words. The head of the association raised his hand, calming him down, and asked what was wrong. The guard trembled when the guild head asked him to leave them alone for a while. Byung-hoon closed his eyes and nodded, giving him silent permission to leave. The door of the office opened. The awakened one asked if his colleague was going to evacuate all the people at once. The old man sat at the desk and explained that they had to minimize the losses, so they needed to declare the expected damage from the invasion and evacuate the people. The hunter asked if he was really going to tell them everything. The man frowned and asked what he was talking about. With a sly smile, Heesung said that they didn't even know when it would happen and asked why his comrade wanted to announce the invasion of class of monsters if it would lead to the entire country being locked down for 3 months. The man looked at him sternly when the guild leader asked what would happen next. Placing his hands on the table, the awakened man said that anyone who lost anything would blame the association for everything, and explained that he didn't know if he would still have a head on his shoulders by then. The hunter walked behind his colleague and added that this didn't bode well for him either. The association leader asked what he should do in that case. Heesung looked back and suggested that he not tell them about the monsters being Classa and hide the scale of the upcoming invasion. He widened his eyes and said that in that case, the people would blame themselves for not evacuating in time. Looking out the window, the guild leader said that he wouldn't call a meeting and announce anything to the public, and asked why they needed to announce this meeting in the first place. Byung-hoon gritted his teeth and asked if his comrade understood how many people could die because of this. The scoundrel smiled widely and said that that was the good part. Punching the wall, the awakened one explained that the more people died, the more they would be needed, and added that the army would not be able to do anything about monsters higher than D class, so the population could only count on them. The hunter put his hand on his colleague's shoulder and said that he misunderstood something. Heesung grinned and asked if he thought this was just a suggestion. The old man closed his eyes. The man grabbed his head, and a voice announced that the Megalosaurus Guild members were currently going on a raid. The clone was doing push-ups on his fists. The protagonist was eating chips. Lying on his copy's back, Sanwoo ordered him to work harder as the rate of strength growth had slowed down lately. Smiling widely, the boy decided that this was the best skill as the duplicates earned money for him, and his stats grew without his participation, and concluded that now he had nothing to worry about for the rest of his life. The young man looked at his phone and noticed that the agent had arrived. Clouds were floating above the building. The student ordered number 1 to wake up because it was time to earn money. Junmo smiled when he saw his friend. Raising his eyebrows, the awakened one greeted him and explained that he needed number 1 to be with him in the territory for rabbit hunting. The heroes stood by the car. The man asked where number 2 was. The hunter replied that he was exercising. Smiling, the CEO of JM asked why his client did not do it himself and suggested that it would help him get stronger much faster. The protagonist looked at him awkwardly and confirmed this, but decided that clones were the ones who should do this. Putting his hand to his chin, Sanwoo said that he never seriously wanted to become a hunter and remembered that he now had a decent income. The agent explained that he had a lot of potential that he was not using to the fullest. The guy raised his eyebrows and decided that it would be enough for him to just take care of himself. The manager opened his mouth and realized why his friend ended up like that. A giant cut appeared on the boy's chest. The student's eyes widened in horror and asked what was happening. His friend's eyes turned black. Junmo said that this would be enough for him. Blood gushed from the wound. The awakened one backed up and crashed into something. His family members were standing there, and they all had black eyes. The hunter grabbed his wound and began to breathe heavily. His mother smiled and asked why he became a hunter. His father was outraged that the boy abandoned them and left. Jiwoo gritted her teeth and asked her brother to save her. The protagonist's eyes filled with tears. Sangwoo jumped out of the hospital bed and screamed loudly. The boy opened his eyes and tried to catch his breath. The sun's rays illuminated the hospital room. The young man looked away when someone suggested that he was having a nightmare. He crossed his arms over his chest and said that he should not move suddenly. The student grabbed his shoulder and realized that it was the man who saved him. The man said that he had a very deep wound. Guild member Kindness raised his eyebrows and said that, according to the doctors, he was very lucky. The awakened looked at him dumbfoundedly and thanked him for saving him. The hunter replied that it was not that important and said that he wanted to talk to him about many things. The door of the room opened. He added that it was not his turn now. The boy's worried parents ran into the room. The protagonist smiled. When he left the room, the couple tried to find out if everything was okay with their son. Holding the documents in his hands, the doctor reported that the operation was a success. The doctor looked at the papers and explained that for now they need to continue monitoring. But the patient is recovering quite quickly, so in a month he will be able to return to normal life. Sanwoo widened his eyes in fear and asked how many days had passed since the portal opened. It turned out that 4 days had passed since then. The woman approached the bed and said that most of the large monsters were taken care of, but according to rumors, there were still many low-class monsters left. The guy scratched the back of his head and said that he did not remember much about what happened before he lost consciousness. Suddenly, the young man's eyes widened. The student looked at his parents and asked what happened to his sister. The doctor looked down. The couple pursed their lips in disappointment. The awakened one asked if everything was okay with Jiwoo. The hunter opened his mouth in horror and asked why they were silent and what happened. The girl was lying on a cot hooked up to a ventilator. The doctor said that they had taken care of her wounds, but she had been infected with a mana absorber virus. The protagonist pressed his hand to the glass. The hospital employee frowned sadly and explained that people usually get the virus from monsters that come out of the portal, and that the disease absorbs and decomposes the mana of its host. The girl's eyes were closed, although it happens quite rarely, but sometimes the virus begins to absorb mana, depriving the host of the ability to live normally if the characteristics of the mana are ideal for him. Looking at his sister, Sanu asked if she could be cured. Standing next to the window, the doctor replied that it was impossible with the current development of medicine, because the virus synchronizes with the mana of the host, and added that the only way to keep her alive is to maintain the level of mana in her body. The doctor frowned and said that they could try to find an S-class healer or get an item like a mandrake or elixir from the other side of the portal, but the chances of that were slim. The guy opened his mouth and realized that it would cost an incredible amount of money. The hospital employee adjusted his glasses and confirmed this. The young man looked down in disappointment. The student grabbed his IV and decided that everything would have been different if he hadn't been distracted by others. In the memory, the man was crushed by the rubble of a building. The awakened widened his eyes in fear. The hunter took a wild look at his reflection and realized that he should have put his family first. One T's subordinate grabbed Jiwoo. A little later, the wounded girl was lying on the ground. The wound on the protagonist's shoulder began to bleed again from overexertion. The doctor opened his mouth wide and called out to him. Sangwoo remembered the giant tiger and realized that he should have been stronger. Firefly crawled out of the cave. The IV line wobbled. The doctor called for a nurse. The guy bent the IV stand. The doctor asked him to stop before the stitches came apart. The young man pressed his hand to the wound. Tears streamed down his cheeks. The student thought about how he could have saved everyone if he worked a little harder. In the memory, a happy family was having dinner at the table. The silhouette of Jiwoo appeared, lying on a hospital bed. The heroes were sitting at the table and chatting about something. Sitting on his bed, the awakened one looked down. The hunter frowned sternly. The protagonist heard some noise and looked away. Heian entered his room. Holding a heavy bag in her hands, the girl greeted him and apologized for the sudden visit. Raising his eyebrows, Sangwoo thanked her and asked if everything was okay with her family. The girl approached him and told him that their house was damaged, but they managed to take refuge in a shelter. The guy was happy about this news and assumed that Dakshal asked her to come. The young man looked down. The schoolgirl explained that her father contacted his superiors and found out that he was in the hospital. There were bottles in the box. The student asked his friend to address him a little less formally, because in this case it would be more acceptable. The awakened one opened the drink and asked her to speak in a way that would be more comfortable for her. The student shyly knitted her eyebrows and agreed. She patted her hand and wished the teacher a speedy recovery, as they needed to continue their lessons. The hunter looked away from her sadly. Heian flinched when the protagonist called out to her. Sangwoo smiled and declared that he would no longer be tutoring her. 2 weeks later, the bright sun shone through the hospital building. The doctor's mouth dropped open in surprise and was amazed at how quickly his patient had recovered. The folded underwear was lying on the shelf. The doctor asked if all hunters were like this. The boy unbuttoned his hospital gown and denied it. The robe fell onto the bed. The young man picked up his usual clothes. The student put his hand to the scar on his chest. The awakened one lowered his head some time ago and explained that he could not continue working as a tutor because of what happened to his sister. The girl's mouth dropped open in amazement. The hunter raised his eyebrows and apologized to her. Smiling, the girl asked him not to worry about it and thanked him for everything. She headed for the exit and assumed that the teacher did not want to talk to her anymore. Fixing her hair, the schoolgirl asked him not to regret it and promised to enroll in that university. Suddenly, the student stopped. Haeyoung folded her hands behind her back and said that she would find herself a boyfriend. The girl looked back and urged her friend not to even think about taking back her words. The protagonist adjusted his tie and shirt. His parents were sitting in the waiting room. Jiwoo was lying on her bunk. Sangwoo headed for the exit and thought that he had no more time for regrets. The guy frowned sternly. The taxi sped down the road. A dossier on Wanti appeared on the Hunter Wiki page. Looking at his phone, the young man recognized that it was the leader of the Canis Guild. The driver turned around and said that they had arrived. The car door slammed shut. The young man looked up. In front of him was the main building of the Canis Guild. The student walked inside and looked away. The office worker smiled and asked if he needed any help. The awakened walked up to the counter and explained that Vanti had asked him to come over so they could talk. The girl raised her eyebrows and said that it was impossible to arrange a meeting without an appointment. The man with the beard turned his head and asked her to stop. The stranger approached the hunter and asked if this was the same Sanwoo. The protagonist looked at him and confirmed it. The woman gave him a puzzled look. The guild member said that this was their guest. He waved his hand and asked the guy to follow him because the captain was already waiting for them.